Hello, everyone. A very good evening and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep. Welcome back to another session on international relations. In the yesterday's class, we had started with India and Pakistan. We had covered the basic introduction and we had covered few important topics as well under India Pakistan. Just to refresh your memory, we spoke about the map of Pakistan. We understood some key locations and we understood the primary difference between the idea of India and the idea of Pakistan. We understood why Pakistan keeps creating so many problems for India, why Pakistan has always been a problematic neighbor. What's the reason? What motivates Pakistan to instigate India? This was a detailed discussion that we had yesterday, and we started talking about the key events in the history of India Pakistan relations. We spoke about the annexation of Junagadh, the circumstances under which India was forced to annex Junagadh because of Pakistan's interference. We spoke about the Kashmir conflict, the origin of the Kashmir dispute, and the role of Pakistan. Right? So, this is where we had stopped. So, today, let's continue the discussion. Let's go through all the major developments in the relationship and then analyze the present state of relations between India and Pakistan. Let's talk about the Indus Water Treaty that was signed in the year 1960. That is the next major development in the bilateral relationship. I hope you know that the Indus is a shared resource between India and Pakistan. The Indus Basin consists of six major rivers, and we share this resource with Pakistan. These are the transboundary rivers that connect India and Pakistan. So, sharing these waters has been a issue from the very beginning. And given that some of these rivers pass through the disputed Kashmir region, both the countries had concerns about sharing of these waters. But India was always in an advantageous position as India is the upper riparian in the case of these rivers. India is present in the upstream of these rivers, whereas Pakistan is a downstream country. It's a lower riparian state. So, given the nature of the Kashmir dispute and the first war that we had already fought, Pakistan had expressed concerns about the sharing of these waters. Pakistan was particularly concerned about India utilizing these waters entirely, and it was concerned that enough water may not be left for Pakistan's utilization. So, to address these concerns, India extended a hand of friendship. Even though we had the leverage, we could have potentially misused the Indus waters to punish Pakistan. India has never done that, and we more than willingly agreed for a negotiated settlement on how we are going to share the waters of the Indus. So, India Pakistan negotiated with the mediation of the World Bank. The World Bank acted as a mediator between the two countries, and we signed this historic treaty in 1960, the Indus Water Treaty. So, understanding the terms of the treaty is very important for the exam. The topic has been in news in current affairs as well. In the last 4 to 5 years, Indus Water Treaty has been repeatedly in news. So, UPSC might ask a prelims question or even a mains question on this topic. So, let's understand what are the terms and provisions of the Indus Water Treaty and why the topic is in news currently. The first point you have to note down is that the treaty divides the Indus basin into two categories. The six rivers basically are divided into western rivers and eastern rivers. The treaty identifies three western rivers, that is Indus, the main river of the drainage basin, Jhelum, and Chenab. These three are the western rivers falling on the side of Pakistan primarily. The other three rivers are the eastern rivers. This includes Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. So, this is how the Indus Treaty divides the Indus basin into western and eastern rivers. And A share of allocation has been provided to both India and Pakistan to provide for a fair distribution for both the countries. With regard to western rivers, Pakistan has larger control over the flow and the waters of these rivers. See, you don't have to sit and mug up the exact division. You don't have to remember the statistical numbers, right? The volume of water which has been allocated to Pakistan and India. That is not needed. Just understand the broad allocation. Is that clear? So Pakistan has been given a higher degree of control. It has a larger control over the western rivers, as these rivers are more crucial to Pakistan. Understood? But that does not mean India has no control on these rivers. India also has been given a limited share of the western rivers. India also enjoys a limited share of the western rivers, but by and large, Pakistan enjoys a higher degree of control on these rivers. So, according to the terms of the treaty, India can build run of the mill projects. India can build run of the mill projects on these rivers, and we can utilize the waters as well for specified purposes. For few specified purposes, India can utilize the waters within the limited allocation that has been given, and we can build run-of-the-mill projects on these rivers. Now, what do you mean by run-of-the-mill projects? Run-of-the-mill projects are those projects which do not affect the flow of the river. It does not involve diversion of the river. It does not involve holding the waters permanently. You're not affecting the water flow in the downstream. Such projects are called run-of-the-mill projects. Essentially, projects such as hydropower projects. Hydropower projects are run-of-the-mill projects. You're not storing the water permanently. You're not diverting the river permanently. You're building dams to hold the water temporarily to create the hydropower potential. Just enough energy to turn the turbines to produce electricity. Right? So once electricity is generated, we allow the water to flow through the natural course of the river. So from these projects, we can utilize a small percentage of the river for supplying drinking water, even for some basic irrigation, and also navigation, and to maintain ecological flow on the Indian side. This basic utilization is allowed for India, but within the specified limit. So Pakistan enjoys the full benefits of these rivers. India has to allow these rivers to flow freely without any interruption. India cannot divert. No diversion is allowed. No permanent storage is allowed on the Indian side. Is that clear? So this is a concession that India agreed to in the interest of building good relations with Pakistan. It was India's attempt at giving Pakistan another chance to change its behavior towards India. Also, water is a humanitarian issue, right? India never wanted to politicize water. We didn't want to play geopolitics by using water. So, based on the interests of the people of Pakistan, right, and the mutual interests of both the countries to build friendly relations, we agreed for these concessions, and we decided that we will allow Pakistan to have greater control over the western rivers. So India will not divert the water, will not permanently store these waters. We'll only utilize the share that has been given to us for basic needs. And we are going to build run-of-the-mill projects for generating hydropower and for fulfilling basic needs like drinking, irrigation, navigation, etc. Got it? So please remember that Pakistan has more control on the western rivers. That is the underlying point. Now, what about eastern rivers? What does the treaty say about eastern rivers? With regard to the eastern rivers, obviously India has been given greater control. As the eastern rivers are more critical for us, India has been given greater control and a greater share because Ravi, Beas, and Satluj, they are the lifeline of agriculture in Punjab, in Haryana, even in Himachal Pradesh, in the Delhi NCR region, right? All across these parts of northern India, northwestern India, there is a great deal of dependency on these rivers, right? Our green revolution was powered by these rivers, by the major projects that we executed on these rivers. Agriculture in Punjab and Haryana in particular is heavily dependent on Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. So India has a greater control. We can build dams. We can even divert the water for irrigation. We can supply the water for drinking purposes, for industrial usage, and for all the required applications on the Indian side. So we get a higher share and a greater control on these rivers. We can build these large dams that can store water for the long term. We can even divert part of the river for irrigation purposes. But whatever remains, right, Pakistan also gets a share. Pakistan also gets a limited share of these rivers. Essentially, India should allow these rivers to flow to Pakistan freely after fulfilling our needs. After we fulfill our utilization needs, we should allow the rest of the water to flow freely into Pakistan. Is that clear? So we have greater control and greater utilization of the eastern rivers, whereas Pakistan has greater control and utilization of the western rivers. So eventually, all the 6 rivers, they flow through Pakistan, they merge and drain into the Arabian Sea. So please understand how the waters have been divided between the two sides. And based on this, I'll explain the current issue, the current development, which brings this topic back into news. There are 2 important issues to discuss here. One is Pakistan's repeated targeting of India by alleging that India is violating the treaty. This has been one persistent issue with regard to Indus Water Treaty. Even though India has fully abided by all the terms, we have voluntarily followed all the terms and conditions, we have never done anything to breach the terms of the treaty, because this is an international commitment we made, right? It's a global obligation, an international obligation that we took up, right? It was mediated by the World Bank, and we made a promise through our foreign policy that we will abide by the terms of the treaty. And India has done that since 1960 till now. We have never breached, never thought about breaking from this agreement or violating the terms of the agreement. Whatever projects India has built, they are in line with the terms of the agreement. Whatever is allowed under the agreement has been taken up by India. But every time Pakistan creates unnecessary problems in order to derail key Indian projects, this has been a persistent problem. It has tried to target India repeatedly by dragging India to court. Pakistan has filed cases against India at International Court of Justice, at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, accusing India of violating the treaty, even though India has never violated the treaty. You guys might have heard about key projects like the Kishan Ganga hydroelectric project. You might have heard about the Baglihar project. There are other upcoming projects like the Ratle project. There are many more that we have planned, especially on Jhelum, on Chenab, and the tributaries, right? Especially in Jammu and Kashmir, where these rivers flow through India. We have planned and built many projects, usually hydroelectric projects, and we have always abided by the treaty and we have ensured that these are run of the mill projects, meaning these projects don't divert the river. We are not changing the course. We are not holding the and storing the water permanently. As per the treaty, we simply generate hydropower, make use of the limited allocation given to us, and rest we release that and we allow that to flow into Pakistan. We have stringently followed this every time in every single project. And yet, Pakistan keeps filing these cases against India to block and derail our projects. Its intention is to harm the development of Jammu and Kashmir. Right? These projects of India will bring better development. With more electricity and water supply, there will be better economic growth and development in Jammu and Kashmir. But Pakistan wants to block that. It wants the people of Kashmir to suffer, right? And then it will use the economic suffering to put the blame on India, to instigate separatist feelings and to promote insurgency and terrorism. Also, this allows Pakistan an opportunity to highlight the Kashmir dispute at the global level, to internationalize the Kashmir issue, and to put the blame on India. In all these cases, the ruling has gone in favor of India. The rulings have favored India because India has not violated the terms. But Pakistan still files the cases to derail and delay the projects, to put India on the back foot and to internationalize the Kashmir dispute. This is how Pakistan has created problems for Indian projects, even though we are abiding by the terms of the treaty. This is one reason why the topic comes in news every now and then, because we have many more projects planned on the Indus, right? On the Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. We have many more projects planned which are coming up, and especially the ones in Jammu and Kashmir are being targeted by Pakistan. So please pay attention to this topic. I want you guys to take a small homework or a small assignment. Identify all the major Indian projects in Jammu and Kashmir, right? The major projects, which includes hydropower projects on Jhelum, Chenab, and the Indus. Please identify them, list the name, and if those projects are reported in newspapers, please ensure you read the article and collect that information. So India has strictly abided by the terms. That is what you should remember. We have obliged by the obligation. It's an international commitment we have made. We have followed the terms of the treaty, and still Pakistan creates problems and it tries to internationalize the Kashmir dispute. The second reason why the topic is in news is because of repeated terror attacks against India that are sponsored by Pakistan. As you know, Pakistan is a state sponsor of terrorism. In the last 3 decades, especially, right? It has waged a covert proxy war and it has carried out many terror attacks in India by using proxy elements, by using terrorist organizations. So every time there is a major attack in India, there is a demand that India should quit Indus Water Treaty. Within the strategic establishment, within the government, from various political parties, from the media, and in general from the public, a section of them are demanding that the government of India should quit the treaty. We should quit the treaty because it will punish Pakistan. As you saw, we don't have any benefit from the treaty, right? If we want, we can utilize all the waters to serve our purpose and allow only the remaining water to flow into Pakistan, right? If we want, we can do that. But India has never done that because we didn't want to politicize water. We didn't want to bring geopolitics into this issue as it will affect the people of Pakistan, right? And yet, Pakistan keeps sponsoring terrorism against India. So, especially during the recent terror attacks, after Uri attacks, and also after the Pulwama attacks, there was a major debate in India whether India should quit the treaty to punish Pakistan. Within the government, several leaders spoke about it. Within the strategic establishment, there was a debate and a dialogue and a discussion on this, right? Even amongst experts and even in the media, there was a lot of discussion whether should we use the treaty as a leverage to punish Pakistan. But the government decided not to misuse the treaty. The government of India has been consistent not to misuse Indus Water Treaty. And there's a reason behind it. I'll explain that as well. See, it's not just the Modi government. Even the previous governments have had similar thoughts. But the final decision has always been that we will not politicize the Indus water issue. We will not misuse the treaty. We will not misuse the leverage that we have. Why? Point number one, don't politicize water. It's a humanitarian issue. Our problem is not with the people of Pakistan, right? These waters are critical for Pakistani farmers, right? For Pakistani industries. Our problem is not with them. Our problem is with Pakistani state, the government, the ISI, the Pakistani army. By misusing the water, right, and by trying to block the flow of water, we will not gain anything. Apart from the immediate gratification you get of revenge, apart from that, you will not get any other benefit. This is a mature thinking on the part of the Indian government. Not just the Modi government, even all the previous governments have had the same thought and they have decided the same. It's a humanitarian issue. Let's not politicize it. Let's not bring geopolitics into it. Let me tell you the practical reason as well. You might think this is very idealistic of India. It's not. There is a more realistic, practical reason that's connected to it. If we weaponize water, let's assume hypothetically, tomorrow there is a major attack on India and India decides to quit the treaty, right? We can. It's a bilateral treaty. We can quit the treaty, right? It's India's obligation. I mean, we have a sovereign right to quit the treaty if we want. Let's assume we quit the treaty and we start misusing the waters. We try to block the flow of water into Pakistan as well. When you weaponize water, it could become a radicalization tool in Pakistan. Essentially, you'll be creating a ground for the terror groups, for the ISI, to blame India for weaponizing water. It will become easier for terrorist organizations to raise recruitment, and right, India will again deal with the consequences of it. The people who are affected could be easily brainwashed. They could be misled by the terrorist leaders and the ISI. They could be brainwashed further to target India. It will definitely, right, raise recruitment for these terrorist organizations, creating deeper security problems for India in the coming days. That is one immediate consequence. Is that clear? Because see, some terrorist leaders like Hafiz Saeed, you might have heard about him. He's the leader of Jamaat-ud-Dawa and Lashkar-e-Toiba, the mastermind of the Mumbai attacks. You might have heard about Masood Azhar, Maulana Masood Azhar, the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed. These terror leaders, they frequently conduct public rallies in Pakistan, and whenever there are droughts or floods in Pakistan, without any reason, they point fingers at India. They say that India is carrying out water terrorism. This is one of the lies that they spread to tarnish India and to drive recruitment into their terror outfits. If there are floods in Pakistan, they blame India. They say India has deliberately released waters to cause floods. If there are droughts, they say India has held back the water, causing floods. In the remote areas, in the villages of Pakistan, where there is no literacy, no education, the farmers, the villagers can be easily brainwashed. They can be radicalized, right? Now, if India were to actually do that, if we were to actually weaponize water, it will become a radicalization tool. It will aid the radicalization attempt of the terrorist organizations and the ISI, causing more serious threats for India. Next, there's another reason, very, very important reason. India has always respected and followed international rules. This is a commitment of India. As a responsible UN member, right, we follow the commitments we make. Tomorrow, if you break your commitment without valid reasons, this could become an excuse for other rule breakers like Pakistan and China. Now, don't forget, we are a lower riparian with regard to other rivers like Brahmaputra. We have concerns about China misusing the waters and leveraging the water of Brahmaputra to have a geopolitical advantage over India. Now, tomorrow, what if China does the same? We don't have any treaty with China, right? We already have a major issue over the sharing of the Brahmaputra waters. If China were to weaponize the Brahmaputra tomorrow, we will not have a solid argument. If we were to accuse China, then they will point fingers at India. You guys weaponized Indus with Pakistan. Now, why are you complaining about China doing the same? Right? That is how it works in international politics. So, India has to be mindful of these larger consequences. What if Nepal brings the same argument over the Ganga? We are a lower riparian. So we have to be mindful of these consequences. You can't simply go on breaking international rules. We are saying China is a rule breaker. It's breaking UN Convention on Law of the Sea in South China Sea. Right? So tomorrow, if we break our commitments, China will also point fingers at India. It will weaken our position on other key issues. So given the larger picture, the assessment of the government of India is that we will not gain anything. We will not benefit by quitting the treaty. Only benefit is immediate gratification. You'll gratify the extremist radical elements here, right, who ask for revenge immediately after a terror attack. Apart from satisfying them, it will not serve any national purpose. It will not serve our national interests. In the long term, there will be a counter impact. There will be a drawback which will affect our other bigger interests. So based on this mature understanding, all subsequent governments have decided to not weaponize the treaty and to not weaponize the Indus waters. So that is why India till now has committed itself. We have followed the treaty and we have not violated the terms, and we have not quit the treaty as well. So this is the decision as of now, but this might change. You never know. If there are major attacks happening back to back, and if we trace the attacks to Pakistan again, you never know. Under public pressure, the government might be forced to take a radical step, and it is possible for India to consider quitting the treaty in the future. All right. So please watch out for this. You might get a mains question as well. UPSC might ask you to explain Indus Water Treaty and discuss whether India should weaponize the treaty and use that to punish Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism. So present these arguments and explain why subsequent governments have decided not to quit the treaty. Because we don't want to weaponize this humanitarian issue. We don't want to affect the people of Pakistan. Next, we don't want Pakistan to get an opportunity to breed more radicalism against India. And we don't want to break an international commitment. Right? Given that we are a lower riparian with regard to the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, we are mindful of the consequences. So given the larger picture, India has decided not to break the treaty. Is that clear? So it's a very important topic. It's a very important topic for your prelims and even for your mains. Next, 1965, the next big development. The second war between India and Pakistan. The second India-Pak war. This war again was fought over the Kashmir issue, and it was again triggered by Pakistan. This was the second attempt made by Pakistan to capture Kashmir illegally. The Pakistani army launched an operation known as Operation Gibraltar. It was a Pakistani attempt to capture areas in Jammu and Kashmir to establish its control over the contested area. Right? So Pakistan launched this operation known as Operation Gibraltar, and India countered this by declaring war against Pakistan. It was a full-fledged war. The war spread not just to the whole borders of J&K, the LOC, right? The war expanded to other borders as well, towards Punjab, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. That way, it was a full-fledged war, because in 1947, following Operation Gulmarg of Pakistan, the war was largely restricted to Kashmir, to Jammu and Kashmir. The first India-Pakistan war was largely limited to the Kashmir theater. It didn't expand across the entire stretch of the border. But the second war did see an escalation. It became a full fledged conflict across the entire stretch of the border. And finally, the war ended with India holding a dominant position. See, experts believe that the war was a stalemate. Neither side won the conflict. Because in conventional wars, sometimes, rather most of the times, it's difficult to identify who won the conflict. Right? 1971 is an exception where India got a clear victory. In most wars, you don't have clear winners. Usually, wars end as a stalemate, like the US war in Afghanistan, right? The Russian war in Ukraine. They've all hit a stalemate. The wars keep dragging, and both sides will claim victory at the end of it. By achieving some immediate objectives, both the countries will claim victory in a traditional conflict. Just like US claimed it won the war in Afghanistan by weakening terrorism. Right? Taliban also claimed that it won the war by restoring its power and control over Afghanistan. Same is likely to happen in the context of Russia and Ukraine. So India-Pakistan war was something like that, the second war. So neutrally, if you look at this as a neutral expert, you will see that the war was more of a stalemate. Neither side won the war clearly. But India has a more justifiable claim for victory because we prevented Pakistani design. When the war was triggered by Pakistan, its intention was to capture Kashmir. But India didn't allow a single part of its territory to be occupied. We pushed back the Pakistani intrusion, fought back quite effectively, and even though it was technically a stalemate, India did hold a dominant position because we didn't allow Pakistan to achieve its objective. We defeated Pakistan's agenda. So that way, India has a more stronger claim for victory in this war. Finally, this war was settled by signing the Tashkent Agreement. The Soviet Union acted as a mediator. Tashkent is in Central Asia today. It's the capital of a Central Asian country. Back then, in the 60s, it was part of Soviet territory. So Soviet Union acted as a mediator, and between Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and the Pakistani leader, a settlement was worked out through which the war was called off. The war was officially brought to an end, and the terms of the conflict was also settled between the two sides. The Tashkent Agreement ended the India-Pakistan War of 1965. The first war was ended by the Karachi Agreement. The Karachi Agreement formally ended the war in 1949. Just like Shimla Agreement of 1972 ended the 1971 war. Is that clear? Of course, there is a whole lot of controversy and conspiracy theory surrounding the Tashkent Agreement and its signing. Because immediately after signing the agreement, the very next day, Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died under mysterious circumstances. The Indian government has never shared enough information regarding his death, and this has given rise to a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories that he was assassinated by a hostile country. So let's not get into that. It's a conspiracy theory as long as we don't have clear evidence to indicate what happened. Right? The government is pretty sure in the public domain that it was a natural death. Right? That's what the government has always confirmed publicly. So don't get into that. I know it's a very interesting topic, but trust me, as a UPSC aspirant, don't get into that issue. It's a conspiracy theory largely. Right? Whether it's true or not, again, it becomes irrelevant for the exam. UPSC will never go there. So leave that topic aside, but focus on the conflict itself. Understand what is Operation Gibraltar. It was a Pakistani army operation to target Kashmir again, to capture Kashmir illegally from India. India fought back. The war escalated across all the stretches of the border. And after several months of conflict, we finally ended the war with signing the Tashkent Agreement that was mediated by the Soviet Union. Next came the third conflict, the 1971 war, which of course we'll not be discussing again, because we have covered this in detail under India-Bangladesh. We understood the liberation of Bangladesh war, right? We understood how Bengalis were targeted, how a genocide was committed against them by the Pakistani army. We understood the divisions between the Punjabi elite and the Bengalis. What contributed to the liberation movement and what role India played in this war. The support we gave to the armed rebellion movement, how India supported Mukti Bahini, right? How we supported Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Awami League, how India went to war eventually and liberated East Pakistan and created Bangladesh as a new country. Right? We have studied this in complete detail, so I'll not be going into it again. So this war ended with the signing of Shimla Agreement, and we studied the Shimla Agreement as well in detail. Some of you, if you haven't attended that class, please go back. You have the recorded lectures available, and please watch that session again. I've spent almost 2 hours in discussing the Liberation War and the Shimla Agreement. It was under the Shimla Agreement that the ceasefire line was renamed as the line of control. India renamed the ceasefire line with Pakistan and we named it as LOC, the line of control. This was a very important change that was done because this would eliminate the role of the UN. It eliminated UN's role in the Kashmir dispute. Remember, I had explained this while talking about Shimla Agreement under India-Bangladesh. So the Shimla Agreement that ended the Third War and liberated Bangladesh officially. Under this, India used the leverage we had. We had occupied the whole of East Pakistan. We occupied territories in West Pakistan as well. Right? We held 95,000 Pakistani soldiers as POWs, as prisoners of war. So by holding all the leverage, we forced Pakistan to agree to rename the ceasefire line of Karachi Agreement. Ceasefire line had been set up through Karachi Agreement in 1949. And UN had given itself a role to monitor the ceasefire by establishing UN Military Observer Group in Kashmir. So UN had a presence for itself on both sides of Kashmir to monitor the ceasefire line. So we never liked the UN involvement. Once India realized that UN is being biased, we wanted to end the third party involvement. We got that opportunity in 1972 and the Indira Gandhi government fully utilized the opportunity. We forced Pakistan to agree to rename the ceasefire line as line of control, and as a result, we eliminated the ceasefire line. So on the ground, the position held by India-Pakistan did not change. Whatever positions we held in 1947 when the first war ended, right? Whatever positions were held at the ceasefire line, even today we hold the same position at the LOC. The boundary has not moved. We simply made a technical change. It was a grammatical change on paper. Ceasefire line was renamed as line of control. Through this clever change by India, we eliminated the role of the UN. Because if there is no ceasefire line, what will UN monitor? According to Karachi Agreement of 1949, the UN Military Observer Group was set up to monitor the ceasefire line. This is what Karachi Agreement says. It says that India and Pakistan have agreed to allow UN Military Observer Group to be deployed to monitor the ceasefire line. Now, if ceasefire line itself is not there, if the word ceasefire line does not exist, and we rename that as line of control, then technically, what will UN monitor? That is how cleverly India removed UN out of this equation. And we made it clear that there will be no third party involvement in the Kashmir dispute from here onwards. This was the big success of India, and we made Pakistan agree to this. Since we held all the leverage following the 1971 war, India's condition was if we have to release your soldiers, if you have to release the 95,000 POWs, give back your occupied territories, you have to recognize Bangladesh first, recognize that Bangladesh is a new independent country, and next agree to renaming the ceasefire line as line of control. So once Pakistan also agreed to it, it became a bilateral agreement. This will have validity. We removed the ceasefire line and renamed it as LOC, thereby removing the role of the UN. And since then, we have made it clear that we will not allow any third party involvement in the Kashmir dispute. So that is India's position. But Pakistan tries to break that even today. It tries to bring the matter at UN, at OIC. It tries to involve other countries like China, US, or other countries to mediate. But we reject any such third party involvement by saying that in 1972, Pakistan had agreed, it made a commitment that there will be no third party involvement. That is why Shimla Agreement is very, very important as far as India Pakistan relations are concerned. All right. Pakistan also made a promise to not target India, to not destabilize India, to not carry out terrorism against India. So even now, when we have discussions with Pakistan, we remind Pakistan of its failed promises made under Shimla Agreement. That's why Shimla Agreement becomes relevant, because we removed the role of the UN and ended third party involvement. And even today, we point out that Pakistan had promised in 1972 to not destabilize India, to not interfere inside India's internal matters and target India with terrorism. This promise had been made. So now we remind Pakistan that you guys have failed your commitment. When India has a discussion, right, when we negotiate with Pakistan, we remind them of the failed promises of Shimla Agreement. If Pakistan tries to internationalize Kashmir issue, we say that you had promised in 1972 that there will be no third party involvement. So we don't allow third parties to get involved in the Kashmir issue. So it's because of this, the the Shimla Agreement becomes very, very important for India-Pakistan relations. Is that clear? Now let's move to the next topic. 1984, the Siachen dispute and Operation Meghdut. We have to understand this in slight detail. The Siachen dispute is indeed a major topic. So let's take a look at this. If you jump a few slides, I've added two maps that explains the Siachen dispute and the Sir Creek dispute. I'll come to the Sir Creek dispute later at the end of this chapter. Now let's just focus on the Siachen dispute between India and Pakistan. If you look at the map here, this map is showing the Siachen area, right? You can see the Siachen Glacier. It is this triangular region. This is the Siachen Glacier that occupies a strategic location between India, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and China. It is located at the tri-junction of these countries. See, this is the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which Pakistan has illegally occupied from India. It's part of the POK, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir region. You can see the LOC, the line of control. You can see important passes like Chorbatla, major rivers like the Shok River and Nubra River. Nubra flows from the Siachen to join the Shok in the Leh region. All right, these are the major geographical features here. You can also see the Saltoro Ridge and the Baltoro Glacier on the Pakistani side. Right, Baltoro Glacier is in Gilgit-Baltistan under Pakistan's control, whereas at Saltoro Ridge, Indian Army holds a critical line. This is what marks the Indian position at Siachen. Is that clear? In this map, you can also see the strategic Shaksgam Valley. Shaksgam Valley present to the north of Siachen. What is the Shaksgam Valley? Shaksgam Valley is also part of Gilgit-Baltistan. It's part of POK. But in 1963, Pakistan gave away Shaksgam Valley to China. It gave it on lease. Basically, it gifted Shaksgam Valley to China. Because after the 1962 war with China, a nexus started developing between China and Pakistan. Because India-Pakistan had already fought a war. The Kashmir dispute was continuing. India-China war took place in 1962. So naturally, the two enemies of India came together. Enemy's enemy is a friend. Right? So Pakistan and China aligned together from 1962-63 onwards. And they signed a boundary agreement through which the Indian territory of Shaksgam Valley, which is part of Gilgit-Baltistan and the then state of Jammu and Kashmir, was gifted away by Pakistan illegally to China. Even to this day, Pakistan and China have joint control over Shaksgam Valley, and they have taken up infrastructure projects via Shaksgam Valley. PLA troops are present here. that is the Chinese troops, are present here along with Pakistani troops, and they're executing key infrastructure projects that passes through Shaksgam Valley and POK. So this explains why Siachen is critical. Experts believe that whoever controls Siachen, they have a vantage point, right? Because on the other side, you have POK, you have Shaksgam Valley and China and India to the south. So Siachen becomes a critical region with regard to its location and geography. Also remember, to the north of Shaksgam Valley, you have the Xinjiang region of China, correct? The Xinjiang province of China is present right over here to the north of Siachen and Shaksgam Valley. And you also have Aksai Chin. This here is Aksai Chin. Right next to Siachen, next to the Karakoram region, right? You roughly have the LAC over here, the line of actual control, somewhere over here. That is a temporary boundary between India and China in the Ladakh sector. And China has captured Aksai Chin from India. This is under the occupation of China. We say that this is Chinese occupied territory. Aksai Chin should be a part of the Ladakh region, but following the 62 war, China occupied and annexed Aksai Chin from India and remains under the illegal occupation of Aksai Chin. So Siachen is located in such a critical region. You have Chinese occupied territory on the other side, Pakistan occupied territory, then Shaksgam Valley, which Pakistan has gifted to China. You have Xinjiang province to the north, and then you have the Leh Ladakh region to the south. Is that clear? So until 1984, India-Pakistan, they had an arrangement. India-Pakistan had an arrangement that since Siachen was not settled, right, the sovereignty of Siachen had not been settled, India-Pakistan had an agreement that both will deploy troops during the summer months. But due to the harsh winter, both had promised to retreat, to pull back the troops during winter. Because see, Siachen has very, very harsh climatic conditions. It's the world's highest battlefield and the most expensive battlefield in the world, right? It's located thousands of feet above the mean sea level. You have extreme conditions here, very low oxygen. At this high altitude, oxygen is very rare. So breathing becomes very challenging and difficult. Temperatures are sub-zero, right? The ground is permanently frozen. There is constant snowfall. The temperatures are in the range of minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius. And you don't have connectivity. There are no roads here, right? The only way you can bring supplies is through helicopters. And because of these harsh conditions, the region is inhospitable for human beings. Humans cannot survive here without protection, without protective gear and clothing and special training. Human beings cannot survive in this harsh climatic region. So soldiers deployed here, they face a very big risk. They face the threat of avalanches, right? Avalanches have killed many soldiers on both the sides at Siachen. They suffer the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. Essentially, their core body temperatures will drop, and your extremities, like your fingers and toes, they will become clotted. The blood flow gets affected and it becomes brittle and breaks off. And if the core body temperature plummets further, it will affect your internal functioning, causing a cardiac arrest, leading to the death of the person. We call that condition as hypothermia, caused by extreme cold, right? That's what happens in cold wave conditions as well. So soldiers, if they have to be deployed here, they face a very hostile terrain and environment, right? They face the risk of avalanches. They face the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. And nature itself is an enemy. So in such a harsh condition, since it was very difficult to deploy the troops and sustain them, India-Pakistan had a agreement. It was like a practice that they followed, that we will deploy troops only during the summer months, and keeping the interests of the soldiers in mind, both sides had made a commitment that we will retreat, we will withdraw the troops during the winter season. But in 1984, Pakistan planned to betray India. It made a audacious attempt to betray India and occupy Siachen entirely for itself. All right, both sides held a position until then near the Saltoro Ridge. India, Pakistan both would deploy troops during the summer season and retreat during winter. But Pakistan planned a betrayal because it kept its eyes on the strategic location of Siachen. Once an army takes over Siachen entirely, it's almost impossible to take it back from the other side. So the geography, the climate, the terrain is very, very difficult and challenging. So Pakistan made this attempt in 1984 to capture Siachen for itself during the winter when Indian troops would be missing from Siachen. Is that clear? So India became aware of this development. There's a very interesting backstory behind it. India's Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, which is our foreign intelligence agency, it picked up intelligence in Europe, in a European country. To be precise, the London station of RAW received a vital tip-off, a very, very important intelligence input was received, that Pakistani army has ordered Arctic warfare equipment from a European defense manufacturer. Pakistani army had placed a secret order with a European defense company. It had ordered Arctic warfare equipment. That is special clothing, special weapons, and other related equipment were ordered, right? And India became aware of this development. This input was received by RAW, and immediately it led to alarm in India. Within the Indian government, there were high-level discussions and debates within the strategic establishment. At this point, the Prime Minister was Indira Gandhi. So under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, all the stakeholders held multiple discussions. RAW, IB, the Indian Army, right, the other armed forces as well, Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry. All the stakeholders held multiple debates regarding why Pakistan would have ordered the Arctic warfare equipment. What could be the reason? Right? Countries like India, Pakistan usually don't need Arctic warfare equipment. So the only conclusion was Pakistan is deploying permanently at Siachen. The only conclusion reached, the assessment, the intelligence assessment was that Pakistan might make an attempt. Right? It might betray us during the winter season when Indian troops are not present. It might use the Arctic warfare gear to deploy permanent troops and to take over Siachen completely for itself. So this was unacceptable for India. It would be a major strategic loss for India. So immediately, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered Operation Meghdut. Operation Meghdut was ordered, which would be executed by the Indian Army. Operation Meghdut was a preemptive military operation of India. That is to preempt Pakistan. Before Pakistani troops can occupy Siachen, the plan was to put Indian troops there permanently to take Siachen under our control. And what's interesting is that India placed the same order from the same company and got it before Pakistan. By working its contacts in Europe, India procured the same Arctic warfare gear that is needed for the Indian troops. And we procured this gear before Pakistan, and the Indian Army executed a legendary military operation. This was not a war. It was not conflict. Not a single bullet was fired. It was all about putting your troops there and occupying the region permanently, preventing the other side from accessing the region. So before Pakistan could make the move, India had a lead. India had an advantage. So we launched a preemptive operation, and the Indian Army successfully executed this difficult mission. Imagine the harsh conditions, right? At the end of the winter, the temperatures are extremely low. It's very hard to reach the area. You don't have roads, no connectivity. Only supplies you can get maybe is through helicopters. So you have to execute the mission on foot. And you need to establish a permanent base and presence before Pakistani troops can arrive. So at the great risk, with efficient planning, the Indian Army successfully executed the mission, and it marked a remarkable success for India. So Operation Meghdut was a successful military operation where India took over most of the Siachen under its control. So when Pakistani troops arrived later, they were shocked, they were surprised. Because see, back then, they didn't have satellite imagery, right? They didn't have access to image intelligence because aircrafts couldn't be deployed here easily. So they didn't have any prior warning or intelligence. When Pakistani troops arrived here, they were shocked. They were shell shocked and surprised by seeing the permanent presence of India. Is that clear? So since then, India controls the whole of Siachen Glacier, and even Pakistan has deployed permanently near the Saltoro Ridge. Pakistan occupies a lower position, whereas we occupy the advantageous position at a higher altitude, and the whole of Siachen is under India's control. So this remains an unresolved dispute. You can see here in the map, the LOC ends over here. This point that I am marking, let me use a different color if possible. This green color dot I'm placing here. This is where your line of control ends. This point is known as NJ9842. Please make a mark. Please mark this point. This is NJ9842, point NJ9842. This is the last point of LOC, the northernmost point of LOC. This is where the temporary de facto border between India and Pakistan ends. After this, there is no boundary. We have not demarcated anything. From here till China, there's no demarcation. So whoever claims and occupies Siachen, Siachen is theirs. So India preemptively captured Siachen for itself, and thus we control this entire strategic region, which gives us an advantageous position, not just over Pakistan, but even over China. Because Siachen overlooks POK, Shaksgam Valley, and Aksai Chin. Is that clear? So this is Operation Meghdoot of India. So today, Siachen remains the world's highest and the most expensive battlefield. Both countries are spending crores of rupees every single day. Every single day. The expenditure needed to maintain this base is very, very high. Not a single bullet has been fired here. We haven't seen any conflict here. But both countries have lost hundreds of soldiers. Close to 900 soldiers have died on both the sides cumulatively over the last many decades because of the weather, because of the avalanches. Avalanches have killed many soldiers here, and frostbite and hypothermia. So nature has been the biggest enemy for both the sides, and yet both countries are taking the risk. They maintain a constant presence here. They incur very high expenses. The human cost is high, and still both countries are retaining their position because Siachen is so critical for both India and Pakistan. So we hold the advantageous position, whereas Pakistan maintains a position at a lower height. Is that clear? So that is why there have been discussions on demilitarizing Siachen. On humanitarian grounds, there have been discussions previously to demilitarize Siachen. If we can work out an agreement, right, to resolve the Siachen issue, we can declare it as a demilitarized zone because it's a cold desert. It's completely inhospitable. We can declare it as a demilitarized zone where both countries will be prohibited from deploying troops. It is possible. Other countries have done it. For example, between North Korea and South Korea, there is a demilitarized zone that exists where both countries cannot deploy any troops. It's a neutral zone. Something like that can be worked out because it's in the larger interests of both the countries. Right? You'll not be risking the lives of your soldiers every year. Every year we are losing soldiers on both the sides. You don't have to spend so much. This money could be used for economic development. It could be used for education, for poverty alleviation, for healthcare. But we are draining our resources on Siachen, on a desert, cold desert area because of its strategic significance. But the talks towards demilitarization did not progress, did not proceed, mainly because of Pakistan's behavior. At one point, India would have considered it if Pakistan was a responsible country, if it had shown a change in its behavior. But Pakistan's history tells us that you can't simply trust the Pakistani state. They say something else, they do something else. We have seen that with Shimla Agreement. So today Pakistan might promise something, we might even sign an agreement, but tomorrow how will you trust the Pakistani state? What if they backtrack? What if they again capture Siachen, then it becomes impossible for India to take it back. So from the Indian Army and Defense Ministry and from all stakeholders, there is a strong opposition against any demilitarization. That's why this issue is off the table. Few years ago, when Prime Minister Vajpayee started a peace process with Pakistan, the idea of demilitarizing Siachen had been suggested, because this is one of the small disputes which can be settled easily. Right? Kashmir dispute is a very large dispute that might persist for many more years. But at least Siachen and even Sir Creek near Gujarat, these are smaller disputes which could be settled with a negotiation, and we can work out a peaceful settlement. So experts say that these are the low-hanging fruits in the relationship, the fruits that you can easily pluck. Siachen and Sir Creek, they can be settled, right, compared to the bigger and more complex Kashmir dispute. But because of Pakistan's repeat behavior at backtracking and betraying, there is no trust on the Indian side. So in the last 15 years, the Indian establishment has ruled out any negotiation over Siachen. Demilitarization is off the table, because if we lose control and if Pakistan were to capture this again, there's no way India can take it back because of the complex region. Right? So the army, the defense ministry, the prime minister's office as well, for the Ministry of External Affairs, intelligence agencies, they're all of the same opinion that there's no need to demilitarize. We are ready to pay the higher cost because we can't trust Pakistan. We can't put faith on Pakistan. It might promise something today, but tomorrow you can't trust Pakistan. So because of that, India has ruled out any possible demilitarization. It's not going to happen. Got it? But few years ago, it was seen as one of the potential issues which could be easily settled along with Sir Creek. If we could settle these two small disputes, it could have paved the way for peaceful relations. It could have set the stage for discussions on Kashmir dispute as well, maybe a negotiated settlement on Kashmir, right? But it's unlikely given how Pakistan behaves, how it keeps sponsoring terrorism against India, right? There's no way India can put that faith and trust in Pakistan. So demilitarization of Siachen is off the table. Is that clear? It's highly unlikely in the near term. So this is what you should know about the Siachen dispute and Operation Meghdoot. Is that clear? I hope you guys have understood all the key points that I have made. Now let's see what happened from 1980s to 1990s, specifically with regard to Punjab. In the 1980s to 1980s, there were major developments in Afghanistan which would have a direct impact on India. All right, I'll give you a brief idea here, a brief introduction to this topic, but we'll actually cover this under internal security. Because under internal security, we have a chapter on terrorism where we study Khalistan movement separately. Here, I'll just give you an introduction to let you know what happened. And this is also an introduction to Afghanistan. Later, when I take up Afghanistan, you will already have the basic introduction covered. In 1979, the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. It invaded Afghanistan, toppled the government, and occupied the country. This was a result of the Cold War rivalry between the Soviets and the Americans. The Cold War, which had started after the Second World War, had led to a series of geopolitical rivalries between US and Soviet Union. In almost every country, they were competing for influence. In almost every country around the world, the US would try to push democracy and capitalism and protect its Western influence, whereas the Soviets would try to promote communist socialist influence. So their intelligence agencies, right, they would target each other. This covert war between the US and Soviet Union, it could be seen almost in every country. It was a covert war and an intense geopolitical rivalry that lasted for almost 40 years. From, let's say, 1947 to 1991. This was the period of the Cold War. Starting from late 1940s, early 1950s, going all the way till 1991. During these 4 decades, there was an intense geopolitical rivalry between US and Soviet Union, the two major superpowers, and they waged covert wars against each other, targeting each other in almost every single country. Even in India, right? We saw that happening during the 1971 war when we liberated Bangladesh. So in Afghanistan, which was a neighboring country of Soviet Union, American influence was on the rise. The American influence was increasing with the then Afghan government, and this got the Soviets worried. Because please remember, Central Asia was part of Soviet Union, right? All Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. These countries, some of them, they share boundaries with Afghanistan, right? Today's Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, they are neighbors of Afghanistan today. But before 1991, when Soviet Union existed, they were all Soviet territories. They were all part of the Soviet Republic. So Soviet Union was a direct neighbor of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a neighboring country. Obviously, Soviet Union expected that in the neighborhood, its influence should be dominant. So as American and Western influence was growing in Afghanistan, the Soviets decided to attack Afghanistan and topple the government to protect Soviet interests. In many ways, it was similar to what happened in Ukraine, right? Even in Ukraine, Western influence was growing. US, European countries, they were increasing their influence through NATO and European Union. And it was said that Ukraine is likely to become a member of European Union and NATO, right? That is what pushed Russia to show its aggression against Ukraine, because Ukraine is a neighbor of Russia. Formerly, they were all part of the Soviet Union. So Russia, to protect its core interests in its neighborhood, attacked Ukraine. First, it captured the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. And now it invaded the country itself, triggering the war to counter the Western influence. So very similar to that, in Afghanistan, to protect Soviet influence, Soviet Union invaded the country and occupied the country. Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. This was in 1979 to counter American influence. Now, some of you might be wondering, why am I talking about this? How is it relevant to India, Pakistan? How is it related to Khalistan? Right? Let me explain that. So as the Soviet forces occupied the country, the Americans saw this as an opportunity. The US decided to create and support a local resistance against the Soviet occupation. Now, this was a great opportunity for them. If they were able to create a local resistance and target the Soviet troops in Afghanistan, that would weaken Soviet influence and it could weaken Soviet presence all across the region. So what the US did was that it tied up the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, which is its foreign intelligence agency. It worked with like-minded countries such as Pakistan through the ISI, with Saudi Arabia and its European partners like UK, France, and others. They all had a common interest against Soviet Union. Pakistan was already an ally of the US. Remember, we had studied this under India-Bangladesh. From 1950s itself, Pakistan had aligned with United Kingdom and United States. It was part of military alliances. It shared a strategic partnership with the US. Saudi Arabia, especially after the oil boom, became a close ally of the US, and it had a rivalry with Soviet Union. Saudi Arabia had an interest in promoting Wahhabism and Salafism as a leader of the Sunni world, right? Saudi Arabia always wanted to emerge as a regional power and a global power amongst all the Muslim countries. And for that purpose, the Saudi kingdom had misused religion. It was misinterpreting religion, promoting radical strands of Wahhabism and Salafism. Saudis were closely aligned with the Americans. They had a common interest to oppose the Soviets, because Soviets were communists who didn't believe in God. They were atheists, right? And Saudi Arabia had an interest to spread radical ideology, especially across the region in West Asia and around it. European powers, of course, they were allies of the US. They were opposed to Soviet Union as well. Right? Europe had been divided during the Cold War between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. So UK, France in particular, along with West Germany, they would back the American policy of exploiting the situation in Afghanistan. These powers together, they launched a covert proxy war. They launched a covert proxy war by recruiting and radicalizing the Pashtuns with the help of Pakistan's ISI and the army. The Pakistani establishment had very close ties with the Pashtun community. Remember, we mentioned who the Pashtuns are yesterday, where they are found. Pashtuns are largely the natives of the Afghan region in southern and eastern parts of Afghanistan, found in Pakistan as well. Historically, Pashtuns have fought against any external invasion, right? It was the Pashtun resistance and insurgency that defeated the British Empire, the mighty British Empire. So they wouldn't stand the Soviet occupation as well. They wouldn't lose their land and resources and their identity at any cost. The Pashtuns are a battle-hardened community. They are used to wars and conflicts from centuries. So Pakistan would work with the Pashtuns and promote their radicalization. For this purpose, along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, that is along the Durand line, radical camps and madrasas were set up. And who funded them? These powers. The CIA, Saudi intelligence, European intelligence agencies. They would pump all the required money, weapons, and even provide training to the Pashtun resistance movement, which was nurtured and created by Pakistan. Pakistan would be the executor on the ground. Pakistan would execute this covert war by building contacts with Pashtuns, by radicalizing them, by misinterpreting religion, promoting radical strands of Wahhabism and Salafism, and creating a terror ecosystem in the region. Who supported Pakistan? The CIA, the Saudis, and few European powers. This was their Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. Their sole intention was to target Soviet troops, to weaken the Soviet invasion, and thus weaken Soviet Union itself. So by radicalizing the Pashtuns and by giving them terror training and putting weapons in their hands, they raised the Afghan Mujahideen. This is how the Afghan Mujahideen was born. Afghan Pashtuns wanted to fight back, right? They wanted to fight back on religious lines. But it was aggravated by these powers, the Western powers, and by Pakistan. They allowed Afghan warlords who controlled all the opium fields to grow drugs on a massive scale. This would also generate the money needed. The various Pashtun warlords, they were given a free hand to grow drugs on a massive scale. Opium cultivation was carried out on a massive scale. Thus, Afghanistan, Pakistan became a major hub of drug production and drug trafficking. They brought weapons into their hands, from assault rifles to the ammunition needed, grenades to rocket launchers, and even missiles and battle tanks, right, were placed in the hands of the Mujahideen. Now the Mujahideen fighters would target the occupying Soviet troops, which became their covert war, the Western covert war against Soviet Union. For Afghan Pashtuns, it was their religious war against the Soviet forces. So in the middle of this, Pakistan was playing a critical role. Right from 1979 to 1989, this war would continue, the Mujahideen war. It was an insurgent movement. The Afghan insurgency continued. And by late 1980s, Soviet forces were defeated, and later they retreated as well. This marked the success of Western countries against Soviet Union in this covert war, in the secret war. By sponsoring proxies like the Mujahideen via Pakistan, the Americans and the Europeans had defeated Soviet forces and marked the retreat of Soviet Union. By then, communism was on the decline in Europe as well. Several East European countries like Poland and others, they were moving away from communism. Soviet Union itself was witnessing a political and economic collapse. Right? The ideology had failed. Soviet economy was struggling. And eventually by 91, Soviet Union disintegrated. Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight. Communism and socialism had failed, causing corruption, causing unnecessary wars like the Afghan war. Right? The defeat in Afghanistan became one of the reasons that weakened Soviet Union. And in general, right, across Eastern Europe and across Eurasia, there was a loss of support for communism and socialism. And the economic suffering was massive. Right? There was a complete economic collapse, right, causing the breakaway of all Soviet republics, leading to the disintegration of Soviet Union. So this is what ended the Cold War in 1991. The collapse of Soviet Union is what ended the Cold War, and then Russia became the successor state of Soviet Union. Rest of the republics, Soviet republics, they became independent countries like Ukraine, Belarus, then Armenia, Azerbaijan, right? All Central Asian countries, all your Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries were born after the breakup of Soviet Union. So basically, the Western countries won the war. They defeated the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed eventually, right? They won the Cold War. But in the middle of all this, they didn't care about what Pakistan was doing. Right now, Pakistan was critical for them to train the Pashtuns, to radicalize them, to supply them with money and weapons and give them training. Right? So the ISI and the Pakistani army had a high degree of control on the Mujahideen. So now Pakistan realized it was in a strategic position. It had a great leverage. It could conveniently divert. Pakistan could conveniently divert a part of these funds and weapons to raise and support anti-India terror groups. Correct? Even if Pakistan were to do that, US will not question them. Other countries wouldn't question them because Pakistan was critical for them to continue supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. The Americans were happy as long as the Mujahideen got the right support. So they wouldn't bother if Pakistan diverted a small part of the consignment towards creating anti-India terror organizations. Not just funds and weapons, but even drugs, Afghan drugs. So what Pakistan did was that in late 70s and by early 80s, as the Afghan war had begun, Pakistan conveniently diverted these funds, weapons, and drugs and used the same terror camps present along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to provide direct support to the Khalistan movement. By then, the Khalistan movement had begun in Punjab. Khalistan extremist outfits had declared a war against India to break Punjab away from India. Abroad as well, in Canada, in European countries like UK, France, and Germany, right, in Italy, also in US, the Sikh diaspora had a big presence, and some of them had been radicalized with Khalistan ideology. So as the Khalistan movement was rising by late 70s and early 80s, Pakistan conveniently saw an opportunity here. Because please remember, by mid 70s, Pakistan had sworn to take revenge against India for 1971, for losing East Pakistan, for India's role in breaking the country and creating Bangladesh. What had Pakistan sworn to itself? It had sworn to bleed India through 1,000 cuts. To bleed India by delivering 1,000 cuts, which basically meant the internal destabilization of India. It basically meant that Pakistan would look for divisions, social divisions in the country. It would exploit them through a covert proxy war. It would secretly sponsor the widening of these divisions and create proxies, that is, establish terror outfits against India who would target India, causing the internal destabilization of the country. So, the first place where Pakistan carried out a major destabilization was in Punjab. Many of them have a wrong assumption that Pakistan first meddled in Kashmir and sponsored terrorism in Kashmir. Terrorism and insurgency in Kashmir came much later, right? In Kashmir, insurgency started in 1987. Almost 8 years before that, 7 to 8 years before that, Khalistan insurgency terrorism had started, and Pakistan was already there sponsoring the Khalistan outfits. So, where did Pakistan get this strength? Where did it get the funds, the weapons, the drugs? It was all from the Afghan war. The weapons given by US, weapons supplied by Saudi Arabia and European countries, the money given by them, the drugs being grown in Afghanistan, they were conveniently diverted into the hands of Khalistan terror groups like Babar Khalsa International, Khalistan Commando Force, Khalistan Zindabad Force, Khalistan Tiger Force. Many such Khalistan terror groups were created, and they were all sheltered by Pakistan. Because Punjab was right across the border, right? So easily Pakistan could pump the drugs into Punjab. That would fetch revenue for these terror groups as well, and it will help in indoctrinating the youth of Punjab, right? Even today, Punjab deals with a massive drug menace, right? And Pakistan is behind this with Khalistani outfits. So many top Khalistan leaders at that point in 1980s, they were all harbored by Pakistan. They were given safe haven to hide and stay away from India. They would be taken to these terror camps where the Mujahideen fighters were being trained. So where the Afghan Pashtuns were being radicalized and trained, right, where Afghan Mujahideen was being raised, at the similar terror camps, Khalistan outfits were also given support. The same infrastructure, the same terror infrastructure would be misused by Pakistan to support the rise of the Khalistan movement. The same funds and weapons would be diverted and channeled towards them. That is the direct link that exists between the Afghan war and the Khalistan movement. Later, when Kashmir insurgency broke out, when Kashmir insurgency and terrorism started in 1987, Pakistan would again link this with the Afghan groups. That is why many Kashmir-centric anti-India terror groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, they all have connections with Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other dangerous terror groups like Haqqani Network. They are all bred by Pakistan. All these terror groups, the Afghan-centric terror groups, they have been bred and raised by Pakistan, right? So it conveniently connected them and linked them with Kashmir-centric terror groups like Lashkar, Hizbul, and Jaish. So these organizations and these terrorists, they share links with each other. They have common sources where they pool weapons and funds. They have terror camps that are all sheltered by Pakistan. So in 1980s, Pakistan completed this link. It completed the link between the Afghan war that was going on with India's internal problems in Punjab and Kashmir. Is that clear? Pakistan created this direct link, and this has been Pakistan's covert war against India. All right? You need to understand this in detail. That's why I've given you the entire illustration. It's also the introduction to Afghanistan. And also remember, we will study this in more detail under internal security. I've given you the introduction right now. Under internal security, we'll go further. We'll understand the origin of Khalistan movement, the impact of Khalistan movement on India, and how India dealt with the threat. We'll cover all of that under internal security. But here, from an IR perspective, just understand the role of Pakistan in breeding and supporting terrorism against India. How it exploited the situation in Afghanistan, how it diverted American money, weapons towards anti-India terror groups, how it supported the rise of Khalistan movement, how it supported Kashmir insurgency and terrorism. That is the link you should understand. Few years later, Pakistan got an opportunity in Kashmir in 1987, because by then a lot of resentment had arisen in Kashmir, especially amongst the Kashmiri youth. By 1980s, the Kashmiri youth, they were losing faith in India. They were losing faith in the Indian constitution, right? Because Kashmir had been militarized because of the tensions with Pakistan. India's approach towards Kashmir was largely from a military perspective to gain control over the territory, right? So as a result, development had been ignored. So the major party, the National Conference, right, we kept winning elections after elections. And one family, the Abdullah family, remained in power constantly. So central government apparently was relying on one party and one family to hold India's control in Kashmir. Right? This was India's military-based approach focused on Pakistan's interference. But this led to the compromise of development in Kashmir. So as there was no development, the region became backward. Right? People didn't enjoy the basic fundamental rights due to the security curbs. Right to movement, right to free speech was constantly restricted. Whereas dependency on one party and one family had led to corruption in Kashmir at the state level, right? The dependency on National Conference being in power and Abdullah family being in power had led to corruption being bred within J&K administration. So against this, Kashmiri youth, they resented this, they rebelled against this. And there was a rumor that spread during 1987 elections that India was manipulating the elections. This was an allegation that was spread. A rumor spread in Kashmir that government of India was rigging the election to ensure that Abdullah family wins the election and National Conference remains in power. So when this rumor spread, it instigated the youth to declare a separatist war, declare an insurgent terrorist war against India, and immediately Pakistan would extend direct support to Kashmir insurgency and terrorism. The various separatist groups that had formed, they would get direct support from Pakistan. Pakistan would shelter the Kashmiri separatists in POK and also along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. It would provide them the required safe haven to operate against India. It would supply them with funds, weapons, and training. And it also created specific anti-India terror groups. It would establish various anti-India terror outfits like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, Harkatul Mujahideen, and later Jaish-e-Mohammed. These are Kashmir-centric terror organizations created by Pakistan. Apart from supporting the local Kashmiris, who are actually Indians, right? They were fighting a separatist war. For them, it was a political war. Religion was not the priority here. But Pakistan introduced the religious angle by raising anti-India terror groups focused on Kashmir and by bringing Afghan Mujahideen ideology into Kashmir. Pakistan even introduced Afghan Mujahideen fighters into Kashmir. So Pakistan was trying to communalize the conflict, to add a communal color to the Kashmir issue. Because see, to begin with, Kashmir insurgency was just like any other insurgent movement, like Northeast insurgency, for example. Of course, the religious angle comes into picture, but primarily it was a political rebellion against the Indian state, right? If without Pakistani involvement, India could have handled this insurgency on its own, just like we had dealt with multiple insurgencies in northeast India. India could have contained the insurgency in Kashmir as well, as long as it was a local separatist movement. So, along with supporting the local political separatists, Pakistan would promote radical religion based terrorism in the Kashmir Valley. Because by 1988-89, Mujahideen fighters were free. Soviet forces were almost defeated, they were retreating. So conveniently, Pakistan brought Mujahideen fighters who were more radical, right? Who had a stronger belief in Wahhabism and Salafism. These Mujahideen elements, Afghan and Pakistani terrorists, were brought into Kashmir to bring a religious color into this war. To begin with, Kashmir separatism and insurgency started by local Kashmiri separatists who are Indians, right? It was essentially a political separatist movement, just like separatist movements in northeast India. The religious color was clearly added by Pakistan by introducing a communal angle, by linking the Afghan conflict with Kashmir conflict. It would bring Mujahideen fighters into Kashmir to target Indian forces. It would raise specific anti-India terror groups, Kashmir-centric groups like Lashkar, Hizbul, and others. And it would use the terrorists to target religious minorities like Kashmiri Pandits. Kashmiri Pandits were the Hindu minority in Kashmir, right? For many centuries, Kashmir had communal harmony. Before all this conflict happened, the Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits, they have lived with great harmony with each other. Kashmir has been a progressive region historically, as it was part of the ancient Silk Route, a trade route between India and Central Asia. So the Kashmiri Muslims and Pandits have lived with harmony for centuries, and this communal harmony was disrupted by using terrorists to target the Kashmiri Pandits on religious grounds. Targeted violence began. Few Pandit families were targeted, and they were given an ultimatum to quit the valley, to leave the valley permanently. So this led to the displacement of Kashmiri Pandits, and the then governments failed to prevent the crisis. There was governance rule in Jammu and Kashmir. There was a coalition government at the center, backed by various major political parties. But they failed to prevent the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits, because if they were to remain, if they were to stay back, they would be targeted by the terror outfits. Already few targeted killings had happened in Kashmir. So this exodus of Kashmiri Pandits widened the division, and it brought the Hindu-Muslim color into Kashmir issue. The Kashmir issue from here onwards would become a Hindu-Muslim issue across the country, and it had a nationwide impact. Now today, let's say you go to any part of India and talk about the Kashmir dispute, right? Almost everyone will connect with the issue. They'll have an opinion on the issue. No one has awareness about what's happening in Northeast India, right? I'm sure many of you have no awareness about what's happening in Manipur. Your friends, your family members have no response to what's happening in Northeast India, but they'll all have a response to what happens in Kashmir. Why do you think that's the case? It's because Pakistan succeeded in adding a communal color to the Kashmir separatist movement. A regular political separatist movement was turned into a religious war and a divide between Hindus and Muslims. This was achieved by using terror groups from Pakistan and Afghanistan to target Kashmiri Pandits, thus driving a division, a permanent division between Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits. So all across India, this came to be seen as a Hindu-Muslim issue, right? As a divide between Hindus and Muslims. That is why any issue in Kashmir reverberates across the country. It has a much bigger impact. The country has been divided, and this is the success of Pakistan's covert war. So if you guys fall under the same influence, if you look at Kashmir issue as a Hindu-Muslim issue, right, you are a victim of Pakistan's covert warfare. If you believe that a genocide happened against Pandits, you are part of the covert warfare of Pakistan. That has been Pakistan's strategy, right? See, genocide is a very different term, a term used where millions are slaughtered with state support. What happened with Pandits was very unfortunate. It was a humanitarian crisis. It was an ethnic cleansing attempt where an entire ethnic group was targeted. Few Pandits were killed, rest were asked to quit the valley, to leave, to pack up everything, leave their homes behind. It was a human tragedy, but it wasn't a genocide. Genocide is something else. You can't simply throw around the terms like genocide. Today, in the media, in movies, there's a lot of propaganda that goes on. Don't go by what you read in newspapers, what you see in TV channels, right? What happened with Pandits was very unfortunate. It was a humanitarian tragedy. It was a religious targeting. But who did this? It was Pakistan. It was Pakistan's strategy to use terror groups to target the minorities so that it will widen the communal divisions across India and add a communal color to the Kashmir issue. This will keep India burning permanently. Right? This was Pakistan's success in its covert war to destabilize India by widening India's internal divisions. Later, the demolition of Babri Masjid by, by Hindutva extremists added more fuel to the fire, causing massive Hindu Muslim riots, which created a base for expanding Pakistan's terrorism to Indian cities. From 1990s, we started witnessing the expansion of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, where Indian cities like Delhi, Mumbai became the target. Until 1990s, there was no base, no support that existed for Pakistan's covert war against India across Indian cities. Pakistan's covert war was limited to the conflict zones of India until 1991. Right? Pakistan's interference was limited to Punjab, Kashmir, and Northeast India. In the Northeast, Pakistan from 1960s had given support to insurgency. From 80s, it backed the Khalistan movement in Punjab. Later, it backed the Kashmir insurgency and terrorism. But after 91, that is after Babri Masjid demolition by Hindutva extremists, it led to massive Hindu-Muslim riots all across the country. So in the communal hotspots, where communal tensions were high between Hindus and Muslims, where there were victims of communal violence, they became easy targets for Pakistan's ISI. Pakistan would expand its covert war to Indian cities because now it had a ready base local support available. Prior to this, Indian cities were never the target of terrorists because they didn't have local support. So after Babri Masjid demolition and the subsequent other riots that happened, Hindu-Muslim riots, they would create a base for Pakistan, which Pakistan has leveraged for its covert war against India. We saw the rise of pan-India terrorism, terrorism across India, particularly across cities. We saw the rise of urban terrorism because now the ISI could recruit Indian citizens. It could easily recruit Indians from different parts of the country who would give local support necessary to wage this war against India. Previously, Pakistan's wars were limited to the conflict zones, just to Punjab, Northeast, and Kashmir, not beyond that. But after 91, we saw a series of attacks against Indian cities, starting with the 93 Bombay blasts. Right? Mumbai has been attacked repeatedly, Delhi, and even other cities, Bangalore, Kolkata, Jaipur, Surat, right? Varanasi. Many Indian cities have been attacked repeatedly, and Pakistan has expanded urban terrorism against India because it got the local support needed following the communal polarization of India. Right? The rise of communal politics in India in the 80s and 90s, it enabled Pakistan's covert war. As the divisions increased between the communities, it became easier for the ISI to find recruits who would give that local support to expand terrorism across India. That is when terror groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji, Hizbul Mujahideen, Harkatul Mujahideen, these groups would be used to target Indian cities as well, with repeated bomb blasts. Then repeated terror attacks that would put strain on India's social fabric. Every attack would increase the divisions further, and it would create permanent tensions between India and Pakistan. India-Pakistan tensions would increase, obviously, with increase in terrorism. That is exactly what Pakistan wanted, right? This is madness. Pakistan wants tensions with India. It wants India to be hostile. because the army and ISI, as I explained yesterday, they will remain relevant only when India is their number one enemy. As long as India is an imminent threat, the army and ISI will easily control power in Pakistan. They will not face questions internally. They'll not face an internal rebellion as long as India is an imminent threat. It's easy for them to ensure India is an imminent threat, right? All they have to do is use the terror groups to carry out attacks in India, target civilians across Indian cities, and it will push India to get hostile. So as India becomes hostile, it will strengthen the position of the Pakistani army and the ISI. So it's a very complex equation we are dealing with, right? So how does India deal with terrorism? That is the big question. How do we deal with this complex relationship? So let's discuss all of this after a short break. We'll take a 15 minutes break. We'll come back and we'll discuss other important developments of the 90s. We'll talk about the recent developments as well, and we'll understand how relations are sustained between the two countries. Were there any positives in the relationship in the last 15, 20 years? Right? What were the lowest points in the relationship? Where do we stand today? That is the last part of my discussion. We can try to wrap it up after a short break. So let's come back. Let's come back by 7 p.m. Also, keep your questions and doubts ready. I'll finish this chapter and then I'll take up all your questions and doubts. So I'll see you back at 7. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the session. First, let me take up some questions and doubts, and then we'll resume the discussion. First question is by Vivek. Sir, why do we find protests in POK for merger with India? Vivek here is referring to some local protests in POK on the Pakistani side of occupied Kashmir, where there has been a call sometimes to merge with India. This has to do with Pakistan's poor administration and governance. Pakistan has failed in its governance across the country, and of course in POK as well. There is large scale neglect of governance related issues. Also, Kashmiri families have been separated, right, because of the dispute. So, every now and then, you do see some locals in POK organizing these protests, but they have no validity because Pakistan will never address those demands, right? So, it's a minor issue, but sometimes, yes, you do witness these protests in POK, but it is unlikely to have a major impact on India-Pak relations as of now. Garvit says, I think it's run of the river project, not run of the mill. Not exactly. Run of the mill, run of the mirror, run of the river. They both mean the same. Projects which don't divert the water, which don't store the water permanently. Harshita is asking, what is ICJ and PCA? ICJ and PCA are international judicial bodies. The ICJ stands for International Court of Justice. We will study that under United Nations. ICJ is one of the primary organs of the UN, the judicial organ of the UN. It's headquartered at The Hague in Netherlands. So ICJ takes cases and disputes from UN member states and from UN bodies and organs. Rulings of ICJ are legally binding because all the countries, right, they're part of UN Charter. They've signed the UN Charter. So since ICJ is a primary organ of the UN, the rulings of ICJ become binding. Is that clear? So countries like India, Pakistan, they can file cases and get it resolved through international judicial bodies like the ICJ. PCA, Permanent Court of Arbitration, it's an arbitration body. It uses arbitration mechanisms to resolve disputes and settle disputes between different countries. For example, in South China Sea, we'll study that later under China, you have maritime disputes going on, right? So countries like Philippines, they have filed cases against China, and PCA ruled in favor of Philippines in that maritime dispute. So PCA is also an international judicial body, but uses arbitration mechanism instead of a confrontational hostile judicial hearing. It holds arbitrations, and based on the claims of both the sides, it will provide for an award. It will settle the dispute through an award, which is then implemented by the countries. So even PCA is headquartered at The Hague in Netherlands. Is that clear? But PCA is not part of UN. It's not a UN body as such. It's an independent global judicial organization providing for arbitration to settle disputes between countries. We will come across them again when we discuss South China Sea dispute, when we discuss United Nations. We will come back to PCA and ICJ. Atar has a related question. Sir, PCA favored Philippines in South China Sea dispute against China. What's the way forward? See, I'll address this under South China Sea topic. When we discuss India-China, there we will discuss South China Sea dispute. So that is where we'll be discussing it, not now. Dave is asking, can Afghan Taliban be used against Pakistan if possible? Afghan Taliban is very close to Pakistan. In fact, Afghan Taliban is largely controlled by Pakistan's ISI. Of course, there are some differences between them, but a country like India can never use Afghan Taliban against Pakistan, right? That's not possible. Also, if you're asking about India using Taliban against Pakistan, we are not in the business of sponsoring terrorism, right? We don't use terrorism to target another country, at least now, at least in the last 20 years. Officially, we haven't ever acknowledged sponsoring any such radical groups. And also, Afghan Taliban is very close to Pakistan. The ISI controls the Afghan Taliban. So there's no question of Afghan Taliban being used to target Pakistan itself. Sahil is asking, is Taliban and Afghan Mujahideen the same? No, not exactly. Taliban was born out of Afghan Mujahideen. Afghan Mujahideen, which was created by Pakistan and US to fight the Soviet troops, right? They succeeded in defeating the Soviet troops. But as the Soviet troops retreated, Afghanistan fell into a civil war. A power struggle began between different Afghan warlords. And in the 1990s, there were multiple Afghan governments that came and went. Essentially, there was a power struggle in the country where some Mujahideen leaders were also trying to capture power. During this civil war in the 1990s in Afghanistan, some of the Mujahideen elements, some of the younger radicals, they formed the Taliban. It was a student based organization. Some of the radical Mujahideen students, right, the younger Mujahideens, they broke away from Afghan Mujahideen and then formed the Taliban. So Taliban is a byproduct of Afghan Mujahideen. It's not the same. Femina is asking, is Coimbatore attack related to Pakistan's recruitment of terror outfits? If you're referring to a failed terror attack in Coimbatore recently, that was carried out by a few local radical elements who are self-radicalized, who are influenced by Islamic State ideology. So the current investigation doesn't show any direct link with Pakistan. Pakistan had nothing to do with the attempted attack in Coimbatore. It was an act by self-radicalized extremists who are influenced by ISIS ideology. Vivek is asking why Kashmiri Pandits were forced to leave and carry out an exodus from Kashmir. That's because the Kashmiri militants, right, the terrorists, they tried to ethnically cleanse the minority community. As the separatist war had begun, right, as separatists were fighting for Kashmir's independence from India, at the instigation of Pakistan, they targeted the religious minorities to throw the religious minorities out, to introduce that communal angle into the Kashmir issue. Right? So targeting the Pandits became a easy task for the terrorists. And at the behest of Pakistan, by targeting the Pandits, the Kashmir issue acquired a communal angle, turning it into a Hindu-Muslim issue. It was never a Hindu-Muslim issue to begin with. Right? The Kashmir issue was not a Hindu-Muslim issue. It would be just like any other separatist movement. But Pakistan's interference and its use of terror groups, its use of radical religion to target religious minorities, added that communal color in Kashmir. What is the Monish? Sai Monish is asking, what is the status of Afghan and Pak relations? I'll come to that. We discuss Afghanistan later. So there I'll explain what relations exist between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Karan is asking, the last question. Karan is asking, what if Pakistan loses all its forex reserves? How will it affect India? See, any collapse of Pakistan is extremely bad news for India and the world. Some people might relish the failure of Pakistan, right? Those who have a very narrow view of the issues, they might relish and celebrate the collapse of Pakistan. But trust me, in reality, the Indian government in particular would never want Pakistan to fail. Pakistan's collapse is extremely dangerous for India and the world because Pakistan possesses nuclear weapons. Pakistan is a hub of terrorist outfits, and there is radicalization within the Pakistani forces, within the ISI, within the Army, Navy, Air Force of Pakistan. There are radical elements present. If the state were to collapse, right, mainly due to an economic crisis or even due to a political crisis, that is the worst news for India and the world, because then the question is, who will get control of the nuclear weapons? What if radicals and terror groups get hold of the nuclear weapons and try to deploy them? Most likely the target would be India, right? So believe it or not, India will do anything in its capability to protect the Pakistani state in that case. We will work with other powers. In fact, this is a nightmare situation for every country. US, all the big European powers, even China and India, they're all concerned about a complete collapse of Pakistan, right? So it's in our interest to ensure the Pakistani state remains. We may not like the Pakistani state, but that is a better scenario compared to a full collapse where nuclear weapons are loose. And if radicals and terror groups get hold of it, that is a worst case scenario, right? So definitely the collapse of Pakistan will have a huge impact, a security impact. The collapse would mean that radical groups will have a free run. There will be more suffering, backwardness, more poverty. So it will be easier for terror groups to recruit the youth, to brainwash them, radicalize them, increase recruitment for their organizations, and carry out more attacks against India and other countries. So collapse of Pakistan will definitely have a huge impact, and countries will do anything possible to prevent the collapse of Pakistan. All right. So now let's come back to our discussion. Let's continue. We had covered until 1990s, talking about how Pakistan supported Khalistan movement, Kashmir terrorism, and how it expanded terrorism across Indian cities and brought urban terrorism right to our doorstep. Now let's discuss the next big development, that is the Gujral Doctrine. The Gujral Doctrine, brought out in 1996-97 by I.K. Gujral. I.K. Gujral was the External Affairs Minister of India and also later the Prime Minister of India. I.K. Gujral became the Foreign Minister of India and later would become the Prime Minister of India as well, briefly, when he headed a coalition government. So under I.K. Minister first and then as a Prime Minister, he laid out a new vision, a new doctrine for India's foreign policy. Because by 1990s, by mid 1990s, our relations with our neighboring countries had collapsed. In the neighborhood, our relations with our neighbors had been very badly affected because of all the volatility and hostile relations between each other. With Pakistan, relations were always affected because of the Kashmir dispute, the wars, and of course, because of its sponsorship of terrorism. We studied how our ties with Nepal was affected. In the 1990s, India was accused of interference in Nepal's internal matters. Anti-India sentiments had started coming up. Nepal had become a base for Pakistan's covert war against India. We also studied how Bangladesh had become hostile to India in the 1980s and 1990s. Right? The military rule in Bangladesh, the BNP government, they were all anti-India and pro-Pakistan, and we were dealing with a hostile Bangladeshi government. The situation was similar with Sri Lanka as well. Sri Lanka had been consumed by civil war. The LTTE, right, had caused mass destruction, and the Sri Lankan forces were also accused of committing mass atrocities against the Tamils. And India was accused of direct involvement in sponsoring the Tamil militant outfits, and our ties with Sri Lanka had collapsed. LTTE had assassinated our former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi by then. So everywhere in our neighborhood, India's image had been affected. Some of it was India's mistakes. Some of it was largely triggered by the neighboring countries, and then India would have responded. But either ways, our image had been compromised. India's image was that of a big brother. India was called a hegemonic power, which imposes itself on small countries, which forces small countries to act against their interests. India was accused of excessive interference in the internal matters of neighboring countries. India was also accused of sponsoring covert proxy wars by financing and supporting extremist outfits. See, even in Pakistan, when Pakistan was backing the Khalistan movement, to break the Pakistani support, India reportedly carried out covert operations. The then Rajiv Gandhi government used the covert option to punish Pakistan for sponsoring Khalistan movement against India. In the late 80s, right, India, through its intelligence agency, RAW, was accused of sponsoring extremist outfits in Pakistan. For every attack by a Khalistani outfit in India, there would be counter-attacks in Pakistan. The idea was to punish Pakistan, put a cost on Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism against India. This strategy of India worked. It helped in breaking Pakistan's support to Khalistan movement. But it gave India an image that India is a country that sponsors extremist organizations and terrorist outfits. You will understand more about this under internal security. We'll study this in more detail. But I'm just giving you a picture about India's image in the 1990s in South Asia. All the neighboring countries, they saw India with suspicion. They saw India as a big brother, as a hegemonic power, which is constantly interfering in their internal matters. Many of them accused India of waging a covert war by supporting extremist outfits and running covert operations in other countries to destabilize them. Partly it was true, partly it was an exaggeration. Partly it was India's mistakes, but in most cases, it was other countries which were triggering India. But nevertheless, our image had been compromised. So I.K. Gujral stepped in and he laid out a new vision, a new approach to our foreign policy to correct this image of India. Is that clear? It was in this context that the Gujral Doctrine was introduced into our foreign policy. The Gujral Doctrine is based on 5 principles, which is inspired by the Panchashil principles, which we are going to study under the next chapter. Under India-China, I will explain the Panchashil Agreement that consists of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that forms the basis, the foundation of India-China relations. So inspired by the Panchashil, similar principles were adopted under the Gujral Doctrine, which would guide India's foreign policy in the coming years. The whole focus of Gujral Doctrine was to correct India's image. The focus of Gujral Doctrine was to create goodwill for India in the neighboring countries. Is that clear? The priority was to end India's interference in the neighboring countries. This was the focus of I.K. Gujral, to end India's unnecessary interference in the neighboring countries, to create a positive image and generate goodwill, and end our unnecessary meddling in the internal matters of the neighboring countries. So the 5 principles include providing assistance to our friendly neighbors in good faith and trust without expecting reciprocity. That was the first principle. India said we will help our neighbors, all the friendly neighbors except Pakistan. We will assist Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Generally, these are the friendly countries, the friendly neighbors of India. India said we will help them, assist them, give investments and funds, execute projects in their countries in good faith and trust without expecting anything back in return. Now, this principle remains relevant even today. Right? By and large, we have followed this principle. Even today, India is a major provider of assistance to all these neighboring countries, and we don't immediately expect returns. Right? We are not looking at transactional relationships. We are looking at creating goodwill for India, promoting our soft power and influence. So UPSC might ask you a question, a mains question, asking you to explain the principles of Gujral Doctrine and whether it is relevant even today in our foreign policy. So I'm preparing you for such a possible question. You have to remember the 5 principles, understand in what context it was introduced, how it is relevant for India-Pakistan relations, and whether these principles are relevant or not in today's context. The first principle is definitely relevant. Right? Through this, we promised assistance to our neighboring countries, to help them, to guide them, to give them funds, assistance needed to execute key projects. And we will do this in good faith and trust without expecting immediate returns. So this is a relevant principle. Even today, we by and large follow this. Right? We help our neighbors with our good heart. We don't expect returns immediately. Right? That is how regional powers should behave. That is how a regional and a major power of the region should behave with smaller countries. It's an obligation on the bigger powers of a region. They have to show the leadership. They have to take the first step, right, to build friendly ties and help others. And once you do that, automatically the goodwill will come back. So we do follow this approach even today, and it remains a relevant principle in our foreign policy. The second, third, and fourth principles, however, are not relevant today. In fact, experts believe that these principles hurt India's interests. They affected and compromised India's interests, especially our covert intelligence capabilities were affected because of Gujarat Doctrine. Let me explain how. Under the Gujarat Doctrine, India made a commitment that we will not interfere in any South Asian country. No country should interfere in the internal affairs of another. We promise that no South Asian country's territory will be used against the interest of another neighboring country. And all South Asian countries must respect and honor each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. These three commitments were made, and experts believe this hurt our intelligence capabilities. Because of these principles, RAW was ordered to shut its covert operations in the neighboring countries, including Pakistan. It is said that because of the Gujarat Doctrine, Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's foreign intelligence agency, it was ordered to shut down all the covert operations of India in the neighboring countries. These covert operations were critical, generating valuable intelligence and also giving us the capability to hit other countries if required. These critical capabilities were wound up because of Gujarat Doctrine for a short period. And many experts, many foreign policy experts and strategic experts and former intelligence officers, they all believe that this hurt India's interests. RAW's intelligence gathering channels were shut in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka. It's reported that it affected our intelligence gathering capabilities and also hurt our abilities to launch covert operations in other countries. Sometimes in foreign policy, it is required. As I told you, in the realistic world of foreign policy, covert operations become a critical tool, right, to influence opinion in another country or to generate classified information that is needed for decision making or to carry out destabilization in another country to serve our interests, right? Sometimes it becomes a necessity in foreign policy to have those capabilities. It's not a question of whether it's right or wrong. It's about doing what is needed for the country's national interests. So shutting down the covert operations of RAW has been criticized. It is seen as a critic of the Gujarat Doctrine. We do respect the territorial integrity of other countries. We have never challenged the sovereignty of our neighbors. We don't do that. But promising not to interfere and not allowing the territory to be used against another country led to the closure of RAW's covert operations, and this is where experts criticize the Gujarat Doctrine. Is that clear? As a general promise, it would have been good, right? Maybe through foreign policy, we don't interfere. We don't support the destabilization of other countries. But as far as intelligence gathering and covert operations were concerned, these capabilities are necessary in geopolitics. Any big power, even small countries, they have these capabilities. That is how they protect their interests sometimes. Right? Look at China, look at Israel, look at US, Russia, right? They all engage in covert operations. That's a reality. They will interfere in other countries. They will destabilize countries if needed to protect their interests. Unfortunately, that is how the world of geopolitics works. But shutting down RAW's covert operations apparently hit our intelligence capabilities, and that is why these principles are criticized. All right, they're not seen as too relevant in today's context. So later, India would have revived its covert operations a few years later, but officially we don't know much because this is largely classified. The government has never said that we are running covert operations, we stopped it, we are resuming it. Covert operations are never spoken in the public domain, right? There's a reason it's covert, it's secret. Governments don't acknowledge them. Governments don't acknowledge any such covert involvement in another country. That is how these operations are to be run. Is that clear? So officially, we can't tell you when the covert operations ended, when it was started, what are the scale of operations we are running today, because we don't know much in the public domain. But based on what is available, right, based on what experts have said, former officials have said, we can conclude that RAW did shut down the operations for a short period because of Gujarat Doctrine, but later it has been resumed. A few years later, within few years, it has been resumed. We do run effective covert operations, but we don't know the extent of it, to what extent. The last principle, the fifth one, this principle is relevant even today. We do follow this and we do abide by this. We agree to settle all disputes through peaceful bilateral negotiations. India is not a warfaring country, right? We are not instigators of wars and disputes and conflicts. We are not an expansionist, aggressive power. We have always sought to settle any dispute through talks, through negotiations, and we have always pursued peaceful settlement if the opportunity is available. Is that clear? So this remains relevant even today. For example, with our border dispute with Nepal, when Nepal created unnecessary problems over Kala Pani and Susta dispute, we didn't retaliate, we didn't go to war, right? We didn't increase the tensions. We said, let's sit and talk, negotiate, and work out a peaceful settlement. Even in the Russia-Ukraine context, we have urged Russia and Ukraine to work out a peaceful settlement, a negotiated settlement, right? So this principle remains relevant in our foreign policy even today. So if you ask me, the analysis of Gujarat Doctrine, principle 1 and 5 are relevant. In some ways or the other, we still follow that even today. But principle 2 and 3 especially, they reportedly harmed our covert intelligence capabilities, and that is the critique against Gujarat Doctrine. Principle 4, it is relevant because we have always respected the integrity and sovereignty of others. But experts believe that this promise that was made, it would mean that we wouldn't challenge the disputes. Experts believe that this compromises our ability to interfere in other countries when needed. That is why there is criticism against principle 2, 3, and 4. But however, the principle itself is relevant. We do respect the integrity and sovereignty of others, right? So this is what you should understand about Gujarat Doctrine. Even though it's an old topic, it is closely connected to India-Pakistan relations because India's covert operations in Pakistan were shut. And this affected our intelligence gathering capabilities in Pakistan and also to punish Pakistan when needed, right? Even for a short period, it did have an impact. So Gujarat Doctrine becomes relevant, and you can even expect a prelims question, right? UPSC might give these 5 principles asking you to check whether they are part of Gujarat Doctrine or not. Or a mains question asking you to explain the principles and examine their relevance in today's context. So please be prepared for this topic. It is a static topic, it's old topic, but still relevant for the exam. So after this, the tensions continued and escalated between India and Pakistan. By 1990s, we already had a lot of tensions because of the Kashmir dispute, the Khalistan movement, because of the terror attacks that had started in Indian cities, right? So throughout 1990s, we did have high tensions, but these tensions were aggravated even further when we tested nuclear weapons. In 1998, India tested nuclear weapons for the second time, right? The Pokhran test. Prior to that, in 1974, we had conducted the first test under the Indira Gandhi government. Now in 98, under Prime Minister Vajpayee, we conducted the second nuclear test at Pokhran that immediately triggered an arms race between India and Pakistan. It changed the balance of power in the region. Pakistan retaliated by testing its own nuclear weapons within a couple of weeks. Just 2 weeks after India's nuclear test, Pakistan retaliated by testing its nuclear weapons, and this increased tensions in South Asia. This was the first time in our history where 2 neighboring countries with a history of rivalry and conflict were possessing nuclear weapons. Basically, India, Pakistan, they came very, very close to a possible nuclear war from 98 to 2001. And this is what worried the entire world. The entire world was concerned about the developments between India and Pakistan from 98 to 2001. Because tensions kept on increasing. We even fought a war, a limited conflict, the Kargil conflict. Right? There were many terror attacks like IC-814 hijacking, the parliament attacks. These incidents kept on increasing tensions pushing the two countries towards war. And the fear was the war might escalate to reach the nuclear level. Right? Such tensions never existed even between US and Soviet Union. Because even during the Cold War, right, US and Soviet Union, they did come close to nuclear tensions, but they never shared direct land borders with each other. Right? They've never fought a direct war with each other like India and Pakistan. So India-Pakistan presented the biggest threat at that point, as we had an active border dispute, the Kashmir dispute, a history of wars, and constant tensions because of terror attacks. So any miscalculation, any escalation in tensions could result in a breakout of a war, and potentially it might cross the nuclear threshold where Pakistan in particular might deploy nuclear weapons. If Pakistan suffers a setback in a conventional war against India, it might be tempted to use nuclear weapons that will push India to retaliate with nuclear weapons. So this became a nightmare scenario for the world, especially the big global powers like US, even Russia, European powers, and China. They were all deeply concerned about the tensions between India and Pakistan. So US started putting a lot of pressure on India and Pakistan to negotiate and to reduce the tensions. Because both countries, they had developed and tested their weapons against international law. We were seen as nuclear rogue states because both India and Pakistan have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have not signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Is that clear? We are not signatories to NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, that prohibits the development and procurement of nuclear weapons. We have not signed CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It bans the testing of nuclear weapons. I'll explain later why we haven't signed NPT and CTBT. I'll come to that later in a later chapter. But for now, please understand that we broke international law. We violated NPT and CTBT and tested our weapons. So both India and Pakistan were treated as nuclear rogue states. That's why the big countries retaliated. They imposed sanctions on India and Pakistan. Economic and technological sanctions were imposed. Even though India's nuclear program was very responsible and clean, we were never responsible for any leakage of nuclear technology from the country, unlike Pakistan. Pakistan has a terrible track record. Pakistan's nuclear program, right, it's largely loaned from China. China secretly leaked the nuclear technology and the material to Pakistan. And later, Pakistan proliferated this technology to other rogue countries like Libya, Iran, and North Korea. In Pakistan, you had a infamous scientist, nuclear scientist, who recently passed away. You might have heard about him, A.Q. Khan. He's seen as the Abdul Kalam of Pakistan, as the primary lead of its nuclear and weapons program. So under A.Q. Khan, there was a criminal network, an organized arms mafia that was selling nuclear secrets in the black market, leaking nuclear material and secrets to North Korea, to Iran and Libya. So Pakistan had such a terrible track record when it came to non-proliferation. Whereas India had a very clean record. Our program was largely indigenous, right? A very safe and clean program following all the safety standards, and we had never leaked or proliferated nuclear technology. Despite that, we were treated on the same lines with Pakistan, and sanctions were imposed on India. Many friendly countries, right, they joined the sanctions. US, European powers, Japan, Australia, many friendly countries, they all levied economic and technological sanctions on India, which prevented the technological progress of India. For many years, we couldn't purchase technology that was readily available in the global market. It hampered our space program. It hampered our other critical programs in science and technology. Even high-end civilian technology couldn't be procured by India because Indian companies and institutions were banned from the global market. So sanctions did have a huge impact, but the problem was India, Pakistan were put on the same level. India was seen as the same as that of Pakistan. So as tensions increased, the US in particular, which had an interest in preventing a war, put a lot of pressure on both the countries to negotiate. to talk to each other and reduce the tensions. This led Prime Minister Vajpayee to carry out a historic visit to Pakistan. Prime Minister Vajpayee visited Pakistan and held the Lahore summit with Nawaz Sharif, the then Prime Minister of Pakistan. These negotiations largely happened under American pressure, right? Under international pressure. There was a lot of pressure on the Vajpayee government to reach out, and on Pakistan as well. There was a lot of pressure to talk to each other to reduce the tensions triggered by the nuclear tests. This was a historic visit. The Lahore summit led to a lot of initiatives. For example, bus and train services were started. The Samjhauta Express was restarted. Direct bus connectivity was set up from Delhi to Islamabad, from Amritsar to Lahore, and also from Kashmir to POK. So bus services were opened, train service was opened, border trade was encouraged, cultural ties were promoted. So all of a sudden, we saw a slight improvement in India-Pakistan relations because of the Lahore summit. Prime Minister Vajpayee reached out with a hand of friendship, right? There was international pressure pushing us as well, but there was an initiative by the Prime Minister as well to try and establish cordial ties with Pakistan. So Lahore summit brought out a lot of successful initiatives, and it appeared that India-Pakistan relations were improving. But whenever there is a slight improvement in the relationship, we have seen a pattern. There is a repeat pattern which keeps happening. Whenever ties between India-Pakistan improves, there will be a removal of the government or the leader in power, or there will be a major terror attack which is aimed at derailing the friendly relations that has developed. Announce that. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Just a small update. On the 7th of September, right, we will not have any classes. It will be a holiday on the account of the Krishna Janmashtami festival. So please remember that. 7th of September, that is the coming Thursday, day after tomorrow, we will not have the regular BHLP classes. It's a holiday on the account of the festival. So coming back to the discussion, Lahore summit led to a slight improvement in the relations. But we have noticed that whenever there is an improvement in India-Pakistan relations, there is a retaliation. There is a retaliation from the deep state, the army and the ISI. They don't want good relations between the two governments. Remember what I explained yesterday. Army and ISI will remain relevant in Pakistan. They'll not face any challenge or questions as long as India is their imminent threat, as long as India remains an enemy for Pakistan. So they don't allow good relations to flourish at any cost. Whenever ties improve, right, they will try to do something internally. They'll try to topple the Pakistani government, remove the leader, or they'll try to launch a major attack against India, which will instigate. So immediately after Lahore summit, the same thing happened. There was a military coup. Parvez Musharraf, the then army chief, he threw out Nawaz Sharif from power, threw out the elected civilian government and captured power in the country and established a military dictatorship. This ended the close relations between India and Pakistan. Is that clear? So as Parvez Musharraf came to power, tensions kept increasing again. Because prior to that, it was Parvez Musharraf who had triggered the Kargil war as the army chief. When Parvez Musharraf was the army chief, right, it was his design to capture Kargil heights from India. This had led to a limited conflict where India retaliated against the Pakistani intrusion and went to a limited war in the Kargil Dras Batalic sector. This was seen as an intelligence and security failure as well on the part of India, because Indian forces, Indian intelligence agencies, that failed to detect the intrusion in the initial days. By the time the intrusion was detected, Pakistani troops were already occupying the Kargil heights. So the only option left for the Vajpayee government was to declare war, to flush out the Pakistani intruders, and the Kargil conflict had already escalated tensions. Now that Lahore summit had slightly improved the relations, the army, Pakistani army, which was trying to disrupt the relationship, threw out Nawaz Sharif and captured power, and Parvez Musharraf himself became the president, the dictator of Pakistan. We again saw tensions increase, right? We also had terror attacks like IC-814 hijacking, which we discussed under India-Nepal relations. The hijacking of this aircraft was a major incident in India-Pakistan relations. India was forced to release three dreaded terrorists, right? The Vajpayee government failed to handle the crisis effectively, and the hijacked aircraft left Indian airspace. The moment the aircraft was taken out of India, we lost all the options. There was no way India could plan a commando raid or a strike to secure the lives of the hostages. This hijacked aircraft was taken to Dubai, then finally to Kandahar in Afghanistan. In 1999, Afghanistan was ruled by Taliban, which was a puppet of the ISI. So Taliban fighters, they surrounded the hijacked aircraft, and the only option India had was to negotiate with the terrorists, negotiate with the hijackers to ensure the release of the passengers. So eventually, the Vajpayee government agreed to release three dreaded terrorists from our custody. And one of them was Masood Azhar. Right? Masood Azhar was in an Indian jail, captured in Kashmir. After his release, in exchange for the lives of hostages, he would go on to establish Jaish-e-Mohammed under the guidance of Pakistan's ISI. And as you know, Jaish-e-Mohammed has carried out major attacks against India, which has brought India-Pakistan to the brink of war, including the parliament attacks of 2001. Right? So these were very difficult circumstances. In fact, Prime Minister Vajpayee had to navigate through very, very challenging and difficult circumstances because constantly there were high tensions from 98 to 2001. The Kargil War, the IC-814 hijacking, the failed summits, the military coup in Pakistan, the parliament attacks, they kept putting pressure on India and Pakistan and pushing the two countries towards war. Is that clear? So as tensions remained high, US put a lot of pressure on India and Pakistan again for one more summit. The US, which was interested in stabilizing the region, right? It didn't want any war between the two sides. It put a lot of pressure on India, Pakistan to talk again, to negotiate after the parliament attacks. Because after parliament attacks, Prime Minister Vajpayee had responded with a military operation known as Operation Parakram. Under Operation Parakram, India mobilized its strike forces, preparing for a war to punish Pakistan for the attack against the Indian parliament. The parliament attack was carried out by Jaish-e-Mohammed in 2001, the newly set up terror group by Masood Azhar, right, whom India had released from custody. This was an attack on the very temple of Indian democracy, right? If things had gone wrong, Indian ministers, maybe the Prime Minister himself or top politicians could have been held hostage, creating a nightmare situation for India. Thanks to the bravery of few Jawans and soldiers, right, who fought back, the attack was largely diffused. So India had to retaliate against this instigation, and Prime Minister Vajpayee decided to use the military option and mobilize the Indian troops under Operation Parakram. But unfortunately, Operation Parakram was a huge failure because the Indian army, the government, they were highly unprepared for such a swift mobilization. Is that clear? The plan was to quickly mobilize the troops, right? Assemble at the border within 48 hours and launch a surprise attack against Pakistan to catch Pakistan by surprise. The idea was to punish Pakistan by making quick inroads into its territory and capturing parts of Pakistani territory so we can force Pakistan to negotiate and give up terrorism as a weapon. This strategy, this was a military option given by the army. It sounded great on paper, right? In theory, it was a great strategy. But in practice, we failed to implement it because the army didn't have the logistics needed. It didn't have the preparation, the planning, the resources needed for such a quick mobilization. What was supposed to be a mobilization in 48 hours took us almost 1 month. By then, Pakistan had enough notice. Even Pakistan carried out a counter mobilization. So basically, in 2001, we were staring at a situation in 2001, 2002, we were staring at a situation where lakhs of troops on both sides had been assembled, right? It was a military standoff, and at any point, a war might have broken out. Now, imagine these were situations under the nuclear threshold. Kargil war was fought when both of us had nuclear weapons. These terror attacks happened when we had nuclear weapons. India prepared for a war under Operation Parakram when we possessed nuclear weapons. So the fear was, if things go wrong, if there is one miscalculation, one wrong assumption on either side, it could result in a devastating nuclear conflict. So the failure of Operation Parakram was a lesson for India. It made India realize that we had to prepare more, we had to modernize our forces. Right? Kargil taught us that there were security failures, intelligence failures. There was failure on part of the Indian Army, failure on part of IB and RAW. These issues had to be fixed. This led to major security reforms in India. All right, we will study them under internal security. Major committees were set up after the Kargil conflict. Several reforms were suggested, many were implemented as well. Right? It began the modernization of Indian armed forces to achieve the scale and capability needed to quickly mobilize troops and carry out strikes in order to use that as a tactic against Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism. So reportedly, the Indian Army has developed, it has fine-tuned this strategy, and it's called the Cold Start Doctrine. It's a refined version of Operation Parakram. Officially, the government and the army deny the existence of such a doctrine. This is a name given by the media and by strategic experts. The media has reported that Indian Army has fine-tuned its approach through better modernization, better logistics, through better planning and preparedness. Apparently, Indian Army has a military option that can be presented to the government where it can quickly mobilize under 48 hours to carry out surprise attacks against Pakistan. In case there is a major attack, right, and if the government decides to use the military option to punish Pakistan, right, the army apparently has worked on a strategy which is unofficially named as the Cold Start Doctrine, right? The idea is to quickly mobilize the troops and launch these surprise attacks to hold Pakistani territory and use that as a leverage to force Pakistan to give up terrorism. So that is the Cold Start Doctrine, which is often reported in news. But officially, it does not exist. The government denies it. The army also does not acknowledge the Cold Start Doctrine. But it's widely reported that based on the failure of Operation Parakram, the strategy was fine-tuned, and there exists a doctrine called the Cold Start Doctrine. All right? But the point here is that this was a period of high tensions. The Agra summit that happened after the parliament attacks was a failure because it happened under American pressure. The Americans were interested in Afghanistan. You have to understand the context. In September 2001, the 9/11 attacks had already happened, carried out by Al Qaeda, that was sheltered by the Taliban government. Is that clear? Osama bin Laden's Al Qaeda, which was supported and sheltered by the Taliban government in Afghanistan, had executed the 9/11 attacks, following which the US had invaded Afghanistan. The US had declared a global war on terrorism, and it was trying to target Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So US expected the Taliban government to cooperate. The US asked Taliban to support the invasion to target Al Qaeda and other terror groups. But Taliban refused. Taliban saw Al Qaeda as a brotherly organization. Taliban was the one which had invited Osama bin Laden and sheltered him and allowed the group to flourish in Afghanistan. So Taliban refused to cooperate, and hence US declared war on Afghanistan itself. It formed a coalition force with approval of the United Nations, right? All the NATO allies came together, and with approval of UN, they invaded Afghanistan. So at this point, in December 2001, the priority for the Americans was to bring down Taliban government, target Al Qaeda, target all the terror groups. And for this, they needed the support of Pakistan. Since Pakistan had control over Taliban, since it had links with Al Qaeda and all the terror groups, including Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, the US demanded Pakistan's cooperation. So it is believed that parliament attacks were planned for this reason, to create a distraction, to create an excuse so that Pakistani troops can be diverted from the Afghan border and brought towards the Indian border. Because Pakistan had no genuine intention to target the terror groups that it had created. That would have led to a rebellion within Pakistan. Radicalism had reached such an extent that within the Pakistani army and ISI, there would be a rebellion if Pakistan helped US to target Taliban and Al Qaeda. So to ensure that Pakistan does not participate in the Afghan war and assist the Americans, they needed a strong excuse. And what better excuse than a possible war with India? So many experts, they believe that parliament attacks had a reason behind it. The reason was to instigate India to such an extent that India will be forced to go to war or take up a hostile action, which is enough for Pakistan to use as an excuse to divert the troops from Afghan border and bring them towards the Indian border. So as the tensions escalated after India launched Operation Parakram, the US was worried. US was worried that Pakistan is getting distracted. Right? There is a possible war that might happen between India and Pakistan. So as a result, the George Bush government brought tremendous pressure on Vajpayee and Pervez Musharraf to negotiate again. They pushed for the Agra summit. It was under this American pressure that Agra summit happened. But Agra summit was largely a failure. Apart from agreeing for a ceasefire, right? Nothing positive came out of it because India-Pakistan had very different positions. India said, we have to first talk about terrorism. Unless you talk about terrorism, we'll not discuss any other issue. But Pakistan said, Kashmir has to be discussed first. If you talk about Kashmir issue, then we'll discuss terrorism. So this position of Pervez Musharraf was unacceptable to the Vajpayee government. Vajpayee government said, talks and terrorism cannot go hand in hand. You can't be talking to us, negotiating with us, and then carrying out terrorism against us. So India rejected any talks without discussing terrorism first. Pakistan refused to talk if Kashmir was not being discussed. This different position of India-Pakistan led to the failure of Agra summit, and the tensions continued for a couple of years. It was only in 2003 that a ceasefire was reiterated because the US was constantly putting pressure on both India and Pakistan as it wanted stability in the region. When there is stability, that is when Pakistan can help US, right? Without the help of Pakistani army and ISI, the US invasion of Afghanistan would be a failed intervention. If US had to target Taliban and Al Qaeda, they needed Pakistan's help and support. So because of this pressure, there was a slight improvement in relations from 2003 onwards. In fact, from 2003, Kashmir insurgency went down. The infiltration also declined because there was American pressure on Pakistan to not carry out terrorism against India, to at least reduce the scale of terrorism. In 2003, they agreed for a ceasefire. This was a ceasefire of 1949. They agreed to, re-implement the ceasefire to prevent any breakout of conflict. And from then, tensions started declining to an extent. Is that clear? Even terrorism in Kashmir slightly declined. Terrorism in other parts of India as well slightly went down from 2003 onwards. But in short, this was a very difficult, complicated period that the Vajpayee administration had to deal with. Is that clear? Now, do you know there were only three countries, three major powers that did not criticize India's nuclear tests? Do you know which are these countries? Can you mention that in the comments? There were three major powers which did not criticize India when we tested nuclear weapons in 98. Which are those three countries? Some of you are getting it partially right. France, Russia, and Israel. Please remember this. There are only three major powers that did not criticize India's nuclear tests. They did not join the sanctions. they did not impose sanctions on India. This was France, Russia, and Israel. They understood why India needed nuclear weapons, right? They've always shared strategic relations with India, and they did not criticize India when Pokhran tests were carried out. That explains the close ties between India and Russia, India and France, and India and Israel. Is that clear? So that's another important point. Now, coming to Manmohan Singh's era from 2004 2005 onwards. Just like Prime Minister Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh also began the relationship on a friendly note. Since ceasefire had been reiterated, there was a reduction in terrorism and infiltration. Tensions had slightly declined between India and Pakistan. So Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, used the opportunity to reach out to Parvez Musharraf. By 2005-2006, Parvez Musharraf had slightly transformed. Initially, he was the instigator of terrorism and tensions with India. He was the mastermind of the Kargil conflict, right? He had played a key role in major terror attacks, including the parliament attacks. So from that image, he had slightly changed towards seeking peaceful ties with India. So Prime Minister Manmohan Singh jumped on this opportunity, and just like Vajpayee and all other previous prime ministers, even he extended a hand of friendship. Following this relationship that started developing between Manmohan Singh and Parvez Musharraf, a secret back channel talk was opened. Back channel diplomacy. You guys might have heard about this term. Back channel diplomacy. It refers to secret negotiations that are done away from the limelight, away from the attention of the media and the public. Sometimes between two countries, especially which are rivals of each other, it is good to have back channel diplomacy. Even US and Soviet Union had back channel talks going on, right? US and Russia have those back channel links. Similarly, India-Pakistan established a back channel link, which was conducted through their secret envoys. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh appointed Satinder Lamba, a very popular IFS officer. He recently passed away. He was retired from service. He was brought back from retirement by the Prime Minister and appointed as India's secret envoy to talk to Pakistan. Parvez Musharraf also appointed his envoy, and they would meet at third countries, in third neutral countries, away from the glare of the media and the public and global attention. Because when there is public attention and media pressure and opposition pressure, you can't negotiate and discuss every issue freely. You can't achieve any progress when tensions are present in the relationship. So especially between such hostile neighbors, the two which possess nuclear weapons, it's good to have back channel talks so you can always have an engagement between the top leaders. This back channel talk was known. It was known only to the top leaders. Not even cabinet ministers and top officials were kept in the loop. These negotiations, apparently they had seen a lot of progress. From 2006 to 2008, it is reported that the back channel talks between India and Pakistan, guided by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Parvez Musharraf, was seeing some progress. And according to reports that came out later, India-Pakistan were getting closer to a historic deal. Most likely, they would have worked out a settlement for Sir Creek dispute, or maybe a settlement on Siachen, or something related to Kashmir, or a mix of all three, which would increase border trade, people-to-people relations, and cultural relations. So when India-Pakistan were about to work out and implement the historic deal, that is when the deadly Mumbai attacks happened, the 26/11 attacks. This again shows the pattern. Whenever India, Pakistan, the two governments get closer, when they get closer to achieving something, when they get closer to making progress in the relationship, it is always disrupted by a major terror attack. When the Mumbai attacks happened, internally in Pakistan, there was a crisis. Multiple terror groups that rebelled against Pakistani army and the ISI. Is that clear? In 2008, Pakistan was facing an internal problem. The popular Lal Masjid was occupied by terror outfits and all the terror groups had united, and they were blaming Pakistan for the crisis in Pakistan and Afghanistan. They were blaming the Pakistani army and ISI for the double game, where they were working with US on one side and backing the terrorists on the other side. Because see, these terror groups, they only care about creating a caliphate, establishing the Sharia and the rigid rule. They don't care about geopolitics. But for Pakistani army and ISI, terrorism is for geopolitics. Pakistan would never allow a caliphate to be formed, right? Pakistan is using radicalism, terrorism. It is using it as a weapon, a geopolitical tool. So once the terror groups realized that, they realized that the army and ISI were helping US to target Taliban, to target all the terror groups. This led to divisions to the army and ISI by all the terrorist organizations. They occupied Lal Masjid, and we were witnessing a rebellion against the Pakistani deep state. So these reasons could have led to the Mumbai attacks. Both the reasons. The growing closeness between India and Pakistan through back-channel diplomacy, where reportedly Manmohan Singh and Pervez Musharraf, they came close to a deal, a historic deal that could have transformed the relationship. Second was the internal problem in Pakistan, where terror groups had rebelled against the army and ISI, and the army and ISI were losing control over these terror organizations. At this critical point, the Mumbai attacks happened, carried out by Lashkar-e-Toiba. Right? This was the biggest attack of its kind. So the Mumbai attacks completely derailed the back-channel talks. There was no way that India-Pakistan could have gone and signed a deal after that. It created an opportunity for Pakistan to unite all the terror groups together, because now they had a common enemy. Right? India, which was seeking to retaliate after Mumbai attacks, obviously became an imminent threat. It united all the forces in Pakistan, the radical forces. It ended the divisions within the Pakistani establishment and the radical elements. They all gave support to Pakistani army and ISI, saying that if India attacks Pakistan, they'll unitedly attack India. So the Mumbai attack served a big purpose for Pakistan. It disrupted the friendly ties that were developing. It broke the back-channel talks permanently. After that, there was no scope for reviving the relationship. No scope for signing any deal or any agreement that could improve the relationship. And it gave a reason for all the terror groups to unite behind the army and ISI and end the internal crisis as well. So this is the pattern you see again and again. Right? Prime Minister Vajpayee experienced it. Manmohan Singh had the same experience. Prime Minister Modi also had the same experience. When Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, he launched the Neighborhood First policy and invited all the SAARC leaders, including Pakistan's Prime Minister, to his swearing-in ceremony. This itself was an unprecedented step, a landmark step. All the SAARC leaders, including Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, was invited. Nawaz Sharif had come back to power. So Prime Minister Modi, who was sending a symbolic message that India will prioritize its ties with neighboring countries, announced the launch of Neighborhood First policy by inviting all the SAARC leaders to his swearing-in ceremony. From here onwards, very close relations developed between Modi and Nawaz Sharif. A personal chemistry started developing between them, just like Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh had reached out to their respective counterparts. Modi also had reached out, and it allowed the two leaders to bond, and there was a positive development happening in the relationship. Under the Neighborhood First policy, India did prioritize its relations with neighboring countries, including Pakistan. Right? A friendly gesture was extended. A hand of friendship had been extended. This personal bond between Modi and Nawaz Sharif led to a positive outcome at SCO BRIC Summit at Ufa in Russia, where India-Pakistan issued a joint statement indicating their willingness to talk about terrorism and as well as to discuss about Kashmir. This was the first joint statement by India and Pakistan in many, many years. At the SCO BRIC Summit, which Russia was hosting at Ufa, of course, India was a participant because India is a member of BRICS, right? We were about to become a member of SCO. Even Pakistan was about to become a member of SCO. We were observers back then. Both India and Pakistan were observer countries at SCO. So this summit in Russia at Ufa gave an opportunity for Modi and Nawaz Sharif to meet again. And they came out with a joint statement showing the willingness to talk and discuss terrorism and Kashmir. This was seen as major progress after years and years of tensions and hostility. Following this, Prime Minister Modi carried out a surprise visit to attend a wedding in the family of Nawaz Sharif. Prime Minister Modi was coming back from a foreign summit and he landed unannounced. It was an unscheduled, unplanned visit, right? That showed the personal chemistry, the bond that had developed between the leaders. So Prime Minister Modi landed unannounced in Pakistan to attend a personal family wedding in the family of Nawaz Sharif. So all of this was good progress, right? It was an improvement in the relationship where the two governments, two leaders were coming closer. And immediately there was retaliation from the deep state. Is that clear? Just like the relations between Vajpayee and Nawaz Sharif was broken with repeated terror attacks. Just like the ties between Manmohan Singh and Parvez Musharraf was broken with terror attacks. Similarly, we started witnessing a series of attacks against military targets. We saw the Gurdaspur attack in Punjab near the border, where an Indian military camp was targeted. Then the Pathankot Air Base, which is a forward air base of Indian Air Force, was attacked by Jaish-e-Mohammed. These were major terror attacks against India, which was threatening to derail the relations again. We saw an increase in unrest in Kashmir. Infiltration attempts had increased. And Pakistan was seen to be supporting mob unrest, where Pakistan was supporting local elements to carry out stone pelting against the army in order to disrupt counter-terrorist, counter-insurgency operations in Kashmir. This was a deliberate strategy, a new strategy that we were seeing. Now, you need to understand the change in strategy here, the change in Pakistan's approach. Let me explain this in slight detail. See, 26/11 attacks turned out to be a turning point. Prior to 26/11 attacks, Pakistan was freely attacking India without any restrictions. Is that clear? It would attack Mumbai, Delhi. It would target railway stations, temples or shopping malls, right? Crowded places, and even strategic targets like military targets or the parliament, government buildings. So Pakistan had no restriction on what it would target in India prior to Mumbai attacks. But Mumbai attacks would change everything. Because prior to this, Western countries were not very supportive towards India. In fact, before 2001, before the 9/11 attacks against US never cared about India, bothered about India. It never bothered about Pakistan's terrorism against India. In the 1990s, we gave a lot of evidence to US to show Pakistan's involvement in sponsoring Khalistan movement and Kashmir insurgency. We showed how American funds and weapons were diverted from Afghanistan and used to fund Khalistan movement and Kashmir terrorists. But US ignored all of that. Because remember, we had hostile ties with US. From 1971 till almost 2001, US was hostile to India. We had aligned with Soviet Union during the Cold War. Even after Soviet Union collapsed, our close ties with Russia had continued. And US was opposed to our nuclear program. It had repeatedly targeted our nuclear and space program, and especially when we conducted Pokhran tests, US was very opposed to it. It was hostile to India and took the lead in imposing sanctions on India. So until 2001, US was largely a hostile country to India. But 9/11 attacks changed this. Right? 9/11 attacks changed global geopolitics. So as US went to war against terrorism, US realized it can't trust Pakistan entirely. For the first time, there was realization in the US that Pakistan is not a trusted ally, that Pakistan is playing a double game, creating terrorists on one side, helping them on one side, protecting them, while parallelly working with Western countries. That is how Pakistan had used terrorism to become significant in geopolitics, to become important for Western countries, right? So if Pakistan is relevant for Western countries, it will help Pakistan on the Kashmir dispute to target India. That was Pakistan's approach and strategy. Now, for the first time after 9/11 attacks, there was distrust between US and Pakistan. US knew that Pakistan was close to Taliban. Pakistan was close to Al Qaeda. And even before US could invade Afghanistan, Pakistan had secretly taken away all the top terrorists. Before the American invasion of Afghanistan, right? Pakistan's ISI had carefully protected all the top terrorists and taken them away from Afghanistan and sheltered them in Pakistan. Is that clear? The top Taliban leaders like Mullah Omar, the founder of Taliban. Mullah Omar was the leader of Afghanistan at that point, the leader of the government, the Afghan government. So Mullah Omar and the top Taliban leadership, they were all taken out by the ISI secretly and protected in Pakistan. Taliban was shifted to Quetta in Balochistan and kept away from the American attack. Top Al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the top Al-Qaeda leaders, they were also taken away, right? Because they were assets for Pakistan. They were assets who were helping Pakistan in nurturing terrorism, which could be used to target India. That was Pakistan's thinking. So as Pakistan took away all the terrorists and protected them, India gave this intelligence to the US. India's RAW had real-time intelligence about this airlift called Kunduz airlift. There is a place in Afghanistan called Kunduz. From Kunduz, all the top terrorists were evacuated by Pakistani Air Force through their Air Force jets, through their Air Force transport planes. The ISI safely brought back all the Taliban leaders and Al-Qaeda terrorists to Pakistan. India monitored this operation. We had real-time intelligence on this and we passed this to the US. By then, US had started seeing India as a reliable partner in counterterrorism, especially after 9/11 attacks. US knew it needed support from someone else, someone reliable like India. As two democracies, US-India started coming closer, especially with regard to intelligence sharing and counterterrorism. Is that clear? So from here onwards, there was growing defense, strategic, and intelligence relations between US and India. But even after this, US would never put pressure on Pakistan to stop terrorism against India. Even though we were sharing intelligence, working together to counter terrorism, US was not putting pressure on Pakistan because it needed Pakistan's help in Afghanistan. But Mumbai attacks would change this. Because in the Mumbai attacks, Lashkar-e-Toiba targeted Western citizens as well. They deliberately picked out American passport holders, European passport holders. So as Americans and Europeans were killed by a Pakistani terror attack, it became clear that Pakistan is a global threat. So following this, the US finally started backing India to an extent. And with the help of US, lot of pressure was put on Pakistan to not attack civilian targets. This was the success of India's coercive diplomacy under the Manmohan Singh government. Is that clear? See, many think that India didn't punish Pakistan for Mumbai attacks. If India were to retaliate through military options against Pakistan for Mumbai attacks, we would have served Pakistani interests. Because please understand in what context the attacks were carried out. Pakistan wanted hostility with India. It was inviting a possible war with India so it can unite all the terror groups. India, which was aware of these developments, had to hold back on the military option at that point. Even though it would have satisfied public opinion, given us a feeling of revenge, it wouldn't have served the larger purpose. Right? It would have brought the terror groups closer to Pakistan and easily Pakistan would have continued its terror war against India. So what India did, we showed restraint. We showed strategic restraint. We held back. We didn't retaliate immediately and openly. India scaled up its covert operations to target the terror groups while getting global diplomatic support to corner and isolate Pakistan. We built evidence of Pakistan's involvement in the Mumbai attacks and used pressure from US and European countries to force Pakistan not to target civilian targets in India. It's not a coincidence that after Mumbai attacks, India has not seen a major terror attack in a city. Is that clear? Terror attacks have happened, not against cities, not against civilians. There could be exceptions here and there, but we haven't seen a major terror incident in an Indian city targeting civilian population. This has not happened on its own, right? It's because of the tremendous international pressure on Pakistan after Mumbai attacks, because India would then retaliate. India can hold back once, maybe, not again and again. India would retaliate again against Pakistan, possibly leading to a bigger war, and India would not work with Western countries if they don't support us in putting pressure on Pakistan. So after Mumbai attacks, as their own citizens were targeted, right, Pakistan's double game was clearly exposed. Links between Lashkar and Al Qaeda were clearly known to the Americans. So finally, there was pressure from Western countries on Pakistan not to attack targets in Indian cities, to not target civilians in India. Even West Asian allies of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia and UAE, they showed a shift. They got closer to India from 2009 2010. All right? Because in 2004, India US had formed a strategic partnership. We had signed a historic nuclear deal. Even in the economic domain, right? With regard to sharing of technology and in the nuclear domain, India US were getting closer. So India was becoming more and more important for the US. So following the nuclear deal, the historic nuclear deal, the sanctions were lifted. The economic technological sanctions were lifted completely. And India US partnership started growing from 2003 2004. US helped in getting Saudi Arabia, UAE closer to India. US has always been very close to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and these countries were always backing Pakistan. These West Asian powers were very close to Pakistan. Finally, they showed a shift towards India. So as India's diplomatic profile started growing, there was greater pressure on Pakistan to not attack Indian cities, to not attack Indian civilians. Right? European countries also put the same pressure. US, from the UN as well, from FATF. We got Pakistan grey listed at FATF. We brought up Pakistan at the UN for sponsoring terrorism. So this coercive diplomatic effort pushed Pakistan to not attack Indian civilian targets and Indian cities. That is why you see a new strategy after 2010. Post 2010, Pakistan sponsored terror attacks. They have focused on military targets. It has focused on creating more unrest in Kashmir. And more importantly, it has tried to revive the. This has been Pakistan's new strategy after 2010, because it can no longer use Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Toiba to attack Indian cities like it did during the Mumbai attacks. You see that clear shift happening in Pakistan's strategy. Because it is under tremendous international pressure, right? India has been able to organize that pressure with help of US, European countries that became closer to India. And also the West Asian powers started backing India in countering terrorism. This combined diplomatic effort pushed Pakistan away from targeting Indian cities and civilians. That's why after 2008, you don't see a big attack in India against a city or against civilian population. There have been few incidents, minor ones, they are exceptions. You don't see a major incident in India sponsored by Pakistan. So what Pakistan has done, it has not ended its covert war. It will never do that. Terrorism is its biggest weapon against India. It has adopted a new strategy, a new tactic. It is targeting military installations like Gurdaspur and Pathankot, Uri attacks, Pulwama attacks. That is the explanation behind these large attacks against military sites. Because attacks against military installations that to near border and disputed areas will not get you the same international support. If Indian cities are attacked, there would be an outpour of global support towards India. Even if India retaliates, no country will question India. But if we are not able to protect our military targets, that to near border areas and disputed areas, and if there is an attack, we will not have the same excuse to target Pakistan. Is that clear? So that is why Pakistan has preferred targeting military installations. From 2014, you see this new strategy in place. We had the Gurdaspur attacks followed by Pathankot air base attack. Parallelly, it tried increasing unrest in Kashmir, increased infiltration attempts, and if Indian army tried to conduct counter-terrorist operations, it would use local elements, local mobs, it would sponsor them to pelt stones against Indian army, to disrupt Indian army's counter-terror operations. So obviously, what the Indian army will do, Indian army or CRPF and BSF, which are deployed in Kashmir, they will open fire, right? They'll try to break the mob, and this will cause a lot of civilian injuries and deaths. Now, Pakistan will publicize these incidents at the global level. That is another strategy. It has tried internationalizing the Kashmir dispute at UN and OIC by using images and visuals from these injuries and deaths that occur among civilians in Kashmir. Pakistan has triggered, instigated the mobs. It has sponsored some local separatist elements to use local mobs and civilians, even women and children, right, to oppose counter-terror operations, to try and disrupt live encounters, to pelt stones against Indian forces. When this happens, Indian forces are pushed into a corner and they're bound to defend themselves, right? So CRPF, which is responsible for riot control in Kashmir, they will open fire, and they've used controversial weapons like pellet guns. Pellet guns, they fire these pellets. They don't cause death, but they cause damage, very serious damage. Several sharpnels are fired, right? It can puncture your body, causing severe injuries. It's one way of mob control, but it's very inhuman and it causes deformity, and people can lose their eye as well, right? And if fired from a close range, people can be killed. So several civilian injuries and deaths were happening, which would be exploited by Pakistan to allege that India was committing human rights violations. It would bring up the issue, bring up these images and visuals at UN and OIC to show that India was committing human rights violations. That is one way of Pakistan internationalizing the Kashmir dispute. So along with these two strategies, it has tried to revive the dormant Khalistan movement. That is why since 2010, you see a revival in Khalistan activities, which was a dead movement. India had neutralized this movement in 1990s through a mix of efforts, through effective counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency operations in Punjab, through covert operations in Pakistan, and through efforts in Europe and US and Canada. We had destroyed the support base for Khalistan movement, right? India had effectively ended the movement by 1990s. But 15 years later, we started seeing an attempt to revive this dormant movement. And it's not happening on its own. There is direct Pakistani support. So the call for Khalistan referendum, the rise of recent elements, Khalistan elements, rise of groups like Waris Punjab De, Amritpal Singh, right? The recent activities in Australia, in Europe, or especially in London, in US and Canada, right? Which has led to attacks against Indian High Commission, Indian embassies, Indian consulates. They're all pre-planned attempts by these elements who are getting support again from Pakistan. There is a planned attempt in the last 13 years to revive the Khalistan movement. So this is the new strategy that Pakistan has adopted following the pressure after Mumbai attacks. As it is under tremendous international pressure to not attack Indian cities and civilian population, it has adopted a new strategy to target military installations, to revive Khalistan movement and increase unrest in Kashmir. Is that clear? So this is where I would like to end today's class. We will meet again tomorrow and we will resume the discussion. We have few small topics left. We will wrap up this chapter and complete Afghanistan as well, and then proceed to India, China. So let's keep these topics for tomorrow. Let's end the session here, and let me see if there are any questions that are left. Just for a minute or two, we can take up any questions and doubts, and after that, we can close the session. Priyanshu is asking what happened in Operation Parakram. Under Operation Parakram, India tried to retaliate for the parliament attacks. We mobilized our troops, but the plan was to carry out a swift mobilization to take Pakistan by surprise. But due to the lack of preparedness and logistics and resources, our mobilization attempts, they took almost 1 month. And by then, Pakistan had carried out a counter mobilization. So it remained as just a standoff. It didn't turn into a conflict. It just remained a standoff. And later, both the sides retreated and withdrew their troops. How did Pakistan get off the grey list of FATF? We'll address that later. We'll come to money laundering under internal security, where we will study FATF in detail. So there I'll explain how Pakistan has been removed from the grey list. Sahil is asking if Parvez Musharraf had changed, how did he allow 2611 attacks? See, please understand, by 2005-2006, Parvez Musharraf was no longer a powerful leader. He had lost control over the army and ISI. Right? The army and ISI, they have their own mind. They don't listen to the government. And Parvez Musharraf himself had lost control. So the Mumbai attacks it's believed to have been ordered by the then army leaders and the top generals of the ISI. Who is Amritpal Singh? If you're asking this question, then it means you're not in touch with current affairs. Right? Just a few months back, Amritpal Singh tried reviving Khalistan movement through a radical group called Waris Punjab De. He conducted many notorious activities in Punjab, and India finally arrested him. Right? He became the face of the revival of Khalistan movement. Why Pakistani army is so strong? See, Pakistan has formidable armed forces because it has invested heavily in defense modernization. Given its obsession with India, repeated wars with India and the Kashmir dispute, from the beginning, Pakistan has allocated massive budgetary resources to build up its armed forces. So Pakistani armed forces are indeed formidable. They do have formidable military assets. Aniket is asking why SARC members cannot remove Pakistan. In SARC, there is no process available to remove a member. When SARC was constituted, no option was included in the SARC charter to remove a member from SARC. And also Pakistan has support from other countries as well, like Sri Lanka, Nepal and others, even Bangladesh. They may not agree to the removal of Pakistan from SARC. So that is not an option for India. All right. So guys, these are some questions. Let's end the session with this. I hope it was another interesting class. Do let me know how it went. We'll see you tomorrow. We'll resume the discussion. We'll wrap up Pakistan and Afghanistan and also start with India and China. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.